She stood in the center of the crowded corporate lobby, 7 months pregnant, while her husband dismissed her with a single signature. Benjamin Walker called her incompetent, accused her of hiding behind her pregnancy, and ordered security to escort her out in front of hundreds of silent employees. Caroline Rogers neither argued nor pleaded. She simply rested one hand on her unborn child and walked toward the exit with quiet dignity. No one in that room realized the cruel irony unfolding before them. The executive who believed he had just erased her future had unknowingly fired the hidden chairwoman who legally owned the very company beneath his feet. Before we begin, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what your local time is right now. Share it in the comments below. And if you believe that true strength is measured by dignity rather than arrogance, consider subscribing so you won't miss our next story. Part 2. 7 months into her pregnancy, Caroline Rogers had developed the quiet habit of arriving at Northbridge Holdings 20 minutes before anyone expected her. The headquarters occupied an entire block in Midtown Manhattan, its glass facade reflecting the restless rhythm of New York mornings. Executives often arrived with drivers carrying expensive briefcases and speaking into wireless headsets before they even stepped through the revolving doors. Associates hurried inside, balancing coffee cups and laptops. Security officers greeted familiar faces with practiced smiles. Caroline always entered alone. She preferred the early silence before elevators filled with conversations about quarterly earnings, mergers, promotions, and ambitious forecasts. Those few peaceful minutes allowed her to observe something numbers rarely revealed. Character. She greeted the janitors by name. She thanked the reception staff every morning. She noticed when an intern looked frightened before an important presentation. She noticed when a middle manager quietly skipped lunch because deadlines had become impossible. Most people believed she simply possessed unusual empathy. Very few understood that she was studying the company she would someday lead. Northbridge Holdings was one of America's largest privately owned investment and infrastructure corporations. Its portfolio stretched across commercial real estate, transportation, renewable energy, logistics, and financial services. Tens of thousands of employees depended upon decisions made inside its boardrooms. Publicly ownership appeared fragmented among several investment trusts. Privately control rested elsewhere. Years earlier, after the death of her grandfather, Harold Rogers, Carolyn had inherited the controlling shares through a carefully structured family trust. The transition had been intentionally concealed. Harold had believed that inherited authority without first-hand understanding often produced weak leadership. His final instructions had been surprisingly simple. Do not lead people until you first understand how they are treated when no one important is watching. Those words had become the quiet foundation of Caroline's life. Instead of immediately assuming the position of chairwoman, she accepted an ordinary administrative role within the company. Her identity remained confidential, protected by legal agreements known only to a handful of individuals. Richard Caldwell, the corporation's longtime legal counsel, knew. Margaret Whitmore, lead independent director of the board, knew. Samuel Foster, the retired federal judge who administered the Rogers Family Trust, knew. No one else did, not even her husband. Benjamin Walker believed his wife worked in corporate administrative services supporting executive scheduling and departmental coordination. He respected her intelligence, at least once he had, but never imagined she possessed any ownership beyond a modest retirement account they had built together. That misunderstanding had never been Caroline's attempt to deceive him. She had simply honored the confidentiality required by the trust until the board determined she had completed her observation period. Originally, she had planned to tell Benjamin everything the day she officially accepted the chairwoman position. Life had taken a different path. When Caroline first met Benjamin 5 years earlier, he had been an ambitious operations analyst working late nights in a regional office outside Chicago. He possessed confidence, certainly, but it had been balanced by humility. He volunteered for difficult assignments. He admitted mistakes without blaming others. He treated receptionists with the same respect he offered senior executives. What attracted Caroline had never been his ambition. It had been his kindness. He once drove 2 hours during a snowstorm simply to help one of his co-workers repair a broken furnace after learning the man's children were sleeping in winter coats. He remembered birthdays. He called his mother every Sunday afternoon. He believed promotions should be earned rather than demanded. Those were the qualities Caroline had fallen in love with. Their wedding had been small, attended mostly by family and close friends. Neither cared for extravagant displays. They rented a modest apartment despite both earning comfortable salaries. Weekends were spent cooking together, visiting bookstores, or taking long walks through city parks where they talked about building a family someday. Back then, success meant stability, not status. Somewhere along the way, that definition began changing. Benjamin's career accelerated faster than either of them expected. He solved operational problems efficiently. He impressed senior leadership with his confidence. His recommendations consistently reduced costs. Within 4 years, he climbed through multiple promotions until he became Regional Operations Director, responsible for hundreds of employees across several states. The title brought prestige. It also brought attention. Executives who had once ignored him suddenly invited him to exclusive dinners. Industry conferences placed him on speaking panels. Business magazines quoted his opinions. Recruiters called weekly. Compliments became constant. At first, Caroline celebrated every achievement with genuine pride. She baked his favorite chocolate cake after his largest promotion. She framed the newspaper article announcing his appointment. She listened patiently whenever he described difficult negotiations or organizational challenges. Yet gradually, something almost invisible began changing. Benjamin stopped asking questions. He started delivering conclusions. Instead of discussing decisions with Caroline, he informed her of them. Dinner conversations became one-sided reports about inefficient employees, incompetent managers, and people who simply lacked his drive. Compassion slowly disappeared from his vocabulary. Performance became his only measurement of worth. Caroline rarely interrupted. She listened. She observed. She remembered. Pregnancy made those observations even sharper. Every morning she carried not only her laptop and notebooks, but also the physical weight of the child growing inside her. Some afternoons, her back ached enough that climbing stairs required careful pacing. Her doctor had recommended reducing unnecessary stress, drinking more water, and taking brief walking breaks throughout the day. She followed every recommendation carefully. She intended to become both a responsible leader and a healthy mother. Inside Northbridge, however, she quietly noticed that many pregnant employees received far less understanding than official company policies promised. Accommodation requests waited weeks for approval. Medical appointments were questioned. Flexible scheduling often depended more upon supervisors' attitudes than written guidelines. Caroline never announced these observations. Instead, she wrote everything down. Every evening, she transferred handwritten notes into a secure digital journal stored outside company servers. Dates, departments, names, policies, conversations, not accusations. Facts. She believed accurate records spoke more convincingly than emotional arguments ever could. Richard Caldwell often reminded her that leadership depended upon evidence, not assumptions. She took those words seriously. On one particular Tuesday morning, she stood near the 20th floor windows overlooking Manhattan while employees slowly filled the office. The city stretched endlessly beneath low clouds. Yellow taxis flowed through intersections like streams of gold. Nearby, 2 junior analysts whispered nervously, "I heard another department lost 3 people yesterday. They weren't replaced. They're cutting everywhere." "What if we're next?" Caroline pretended not to hear. Instead, she quietly noted their anxiety. Fear rarely appeared on financial statements, yet it always influenced performance. Moments later, Benjamin stepped from the executive elevator wearing a tailored navy suit that seemed perfectly fitted to his growing confidence. Several managers immediately approached him. He barely noticed Caroline. "Morning," he said without slowing his pace. "Good morning," she answered warmly. He nodded once before disappearing into a conference room already filled with directors waiting for him. Years earlier, he would have stopped, asked how she felt, asked whether the baby had been kicking during the night, asked whether she needed anything before beginning another demanding day. Now meetings came first. Everything else waited. Caroline rested one hand against her stomach as the baby shifted gently beneath her palm. She smiled, despite the growing distance between herself and the man she had married. Love, she had learned, did not always disappear with dramatic arguments. Sometimes it faded quietly beneath accumulating choices. Around her, Northbridge Holdings continued operating exactly as it always had. Phones rang, printers hummed, elevators opened and closed. Executives discussed expansion strategies. Employees hurried toward deadlines. No one noticed that the woman organizing administrative files was also the legal owner of everything surrounding them. And no one, not even Benjamin Walker, could imagine that every silent observation Caroline recorded was bringing the company closer to a day when truth would no longer remain hidden. The promotion that transformed Benjamin Walker's career arrived on a rainy Monday morning. His appointment as Regional Operations Director was announced through a company-wide email praising his exceptional leadership, operational discipline, and unwavering commitment to organizational excellence. By lunchtime, congratulatory messages flooded his inbox. Executives who had barely remembered his name a year earlier now invited him to strategy sessions and private dinners. His office moved from the 15th floor to the executive level, where thick carpeting softened footsteps and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the Manhattan skyline. Benjamin accepted every compliment with a smile. At first, Caroline believed he deserved them. He had worked long hours for years. He had sacrificed weekends, holidays, and countless evenings solving problems others avoided. His promotion was not an accident. But promotions did not merely reveal achievement. Sometimes they revealed character. During his first week in the new position, Benjamin began using phrases Caroline had never heard from him before. "We have to send a message." "People perform better when they're afraid to fail." "Compassion is expensive." "The company owes employees opportunities, not comfort." None of those statements were directed at Caroline. He simply spoke them as facts during dinner while checking emails between bites of food. Caroline rarely challenged him. Instead, she listened quietly, watching how easily ambition had begun replacing empathy. One evening after Benjamin fell asleep with his laptop still open beside him, Caroline carefully covered him with a blanket before closing the computer. She looked at the tired man she had once known so well. The ambition was familiar. The arrogance was not. The following morning, Benjamin attended his first executive leadership meeting. Waiting inside the conference room were 3 people who would soon influence nearly every major decision he made. Victoria Sloan arrived first. As Vice President of Human Resources, she possessed nearly 25 years of corporate experience. She spoke softly, smiled often, and rarely raised her voice. Behind that polished professionalism stood someone who understood power exceptionally well. Victoria believed policies existed to protect executives before employees. She preferred loyalty over honesty. When complaints surfaced, her first instinct was never to ask whether they were true. It was to determine whether they threatened management. Benjamin admired her confidence almost immediately. Next came Ethan Brooks, Chief Financial Controller. Ethan's reputation centered on numbers, budgets, forecasts, cost reductions. He could explain complicated financial reports in language every executive understood. Yet Caroline would later discover that Ethan possessed another talent. He knew exactly how to move money without attracting attention. Nothing illegal appeared obvious. Everything remained hidden beneath layers of procedural approvals. Finally came Melissa Grant. Officially, she served as Benjamin's executive assistant. Unofficially, she became his loudest admirer. Melissa anticipated every need before Benjamin voiced it. She praised every presentation. She laughed at every joke. Whenever Benjamin questioned himself, Melissa immediately assured him he had been correct all along. "You're exactly what this company needs," she often told him. "Someone willing to make hard decisions." Compliments repeated often enough begin sounding like truth. Within weeks, Benjamin stopped questioning them. Meanwhile, Caroline continued arriving before sunrise. Her responsibilities remained ordinary: scheduling meetings, organizing departmental correspondence, preparing executive briefing packets, updating administrative records. Most employees barely noticed her. She preferred it that way. Invisible people often witnessed the most important conversations. One afternoon, she delivered printed reports to Human Resources. The office door stood slightly open. Inside, Victoria Sloan spoke with 2 department managers. "We're approving fewer accommodation requests this quarter," Victoria said calmly. "But several employees have medical documentation," one manager replied. Victoria shrugged. Documentation doesn't require approval. What if someone files a complaint? They'll speak to HR. And HR, Victoria smiled. Is me. The room grew quiet. Caroline continued walking without making her presence known. Later that afternoon, she opened the employee policy manual stored on the company's internal network. Section after section promised reasonable accommodations, equal opportunity, protection against retaliation, support for pregnancy-related medical needs. The written policies appeared exemplary. Reality looked different. Caroline quietly opened her notebook. She wrote only facts. Date, time, department, policy reference, observed discrepancy. Nothing more. Her grandfather had once told her that emotions faded. Records remained. Over the following weeks, similar observations accumulated. A pregnant accountant requested temporary seating adjustments because prolonged standing caused severe back pain. Approval delayed. A warehouse supervisor recommended flexible scheduling for an employee undergoing prenatal treatment. Request denied without explanation. An analyst returned from maternity leave only to discover her responsibilities had been reassigned permanently. Human Resources described the decision as organizational restructuring. Caroline noticed a pattern. Each incident alone appeared insignificant. Together they formed something larger, something systematic. She documented everything carefully, not because she expected immediate action, because truth required patience. Richard Caldwell had taught her another valuable lesson during her preparation to become chairwoman. Never confuse suspicion with evidence. So Caroline collected evidence. She preserved publicly available policy revisions. She saved official department announcements. Whenever employees voluntarily discussed procedural concerns within normal workplace conversations, she simply listened. She never encouraged complaints. She never investigated personally. She merely recorded what naturally occurred around her. Her pregnancy progressed steadily. Some mornings, nausea returned unexpectedly. Her doctor recommended reducing physical strain whenever possible. Benjamin barely noticed. He was traveling almost constantly. Chicago, Boston, Dallas, Atlanta. Every successful business trip strengthened his reputation. Every promotion discussion inflated his confidence. At home, their conversations grew shorter. "How was your day?" Caroline asked one evening. "Busy." What made it busy? Personnel issues. He loosened his tie while glancing toward his phone. Some employees just don't understand accountability. Caroline waited. Benjamin continued. Honestly, people have become too comfortable expecting special treatment. He never looked directly at her. Instead, he reviewed tomorrow's meeting schedule displayed on his screen. Caroline rested her hand gently across her stomach. Their baby kicked. She smiled instinctively. Benjamin missed it, not intentionally, simply because he wasn't looking. The distance between them no longer came from arguments. It came from attention given elsewhere. Inside Northbridge, whispers gradually replaced confidence. Employees noticed increasing pressure. Department heads demanded longer hours. Vacation requests faced unusual scrutiny. Performance reviews became harsher. Managers who questioned executive decisions quietly disappeared from leadership meetings. Nobody openly challenged the changes. Mortgages required paychecks. Families depended upon health insurance. Silence became safer than honesty. Caroline understood that fear spread through organizations the same way cracks spread through glass, almost invisibly, until one day the damage became impossible to ignore. Late one Friday afternoon, she received a routine assignment, organizing archived executive correspondence. Among hundreds of ordinary documents, one email chain caught her attention. It involved staffing reductions. Benjamin had written, "We need visible examples. Performance culture only changes when employees understand consequences." Victoria replied within minutes. "HR can support the messaging." Melissa followed shortly afterward. "I'll prepare the meeting schedule." The language itself violated no policy, yet something about the phrase visible examples unsettled Caroline. She saved the correspondence according to standard document retention procedures before returning to work. She wrote one additional note in her private journal that evening. Leadership increasingly emphasizes public discipline over private correction. Just one sentence, no conclusions, no accusations, only observation. Outside her apartment window, New York shimmered beneath thousands of lights. Benjamin arrived home well after 9. He looked energized despite the late hour. "I think we're finally getting this company under control," he said while loosening his jacket. Caroline looked up from the baby clothes she had been folding. "What makes you say that?" He smiled confidently. "People are starting to understand who's in charge." Caroline returned her attention to the tiny blue blanket resting across her lap. She folded one corner carefully before answering. "I hope they also understand why." Benjamin didn't respond. His phone vibrated. Another executive email, another urgent discussion, another opportunity to prove himself. He walked into his home office without noticing that Caroline remained seated in complete silence, gently holding the first blanket their child would someday use. Across the city, digital files continued accumulating inside secure legal archives. Emails, policy revisions, meeting records. Nothing dramatic, nothing explosive, only ordinary documents created during ordinary business days. Benjamin believed leadership was built through authority. Caroline understood something far more enduring. In the end, organizations were rarely changed by the loudest voice in the room. They were changed by the quiet evidence no one realized had been preserved. Monday morning arrived with unusual energy inside Northbridge Holdings. The quarterly operations meeting had become one of the most anticipated events of the year. Department heads from multiple regional offices had flown into New York during the weekend. Video screens connected managers from Chicago, Dallas, Seattle, Miami, Denver, and Boston. Nearly every employee working at headquarters had been instructed to attend either in person or through internal broadcast. Benjamin Walker intended for the meeting to demonstrate one thing: leadership. He reviewed his presentation twice before sunrise. Charts showed increased productivity. Expense reductions appeared impressive. Projected revenue exceeded expectations. Everything looked exactly as he wanted the board to see. Only one section remained unwritten: the example. Over the previous several weeks, Benjamin had become increasingly convinced that employees had grown too comfortable questioning authority. Victoria Sloan had reinforced that belief repeatedly. "Strong leaders create visible standards," she told him during a planning meeting. "They don't correct people privately. They do when the mistake is small. And when it isn't," Victoria folded her hands calmly, "they demonstrate consequences." Benjamin nodded thoughtfully. The conversation remained with him long after it ended. Later that same morning, Melissa Grant entered his office carrying several folders. "The termination paperwork is ready." Benjamin barely looked up. "For everyone." Melissa hesitated. "The others can wait." She placed one folder separately on his desk. "I think this one sends the strongest message." Benjamin opened it. The employee's name appeared immediately: Caroline Rogers. He leaned back in his chair. For several seconds he said nothing. Melissa interpreted his silence as hesitation. "You've mentioned several times that she's become distracted lately." Benjamin sighed. "She's had difficulty keeping pace." "Everyone knows she's pregnant." "Exactly." Melissa lowered her voice. "If leadership starts making exceptions because of personal circumstances, every department will expect special treatment." Benjamin closed the folder. His expression hardened. "We'll handle it today." Melissa smiled politely. "I'll notify Human Resources." Neither of them questioned whether proper procedures had been completed. No formal performance improvement plan existed. No written coaching process had been documented. No independent review had occurred. Company policy required each of those steps before termination. Benjamin never asked. Victoria never reminded him. By 9 o'clock, the auditorium buzzed with quiet conversation. Rows of employees filled nearly every seat. Managers greeted one another. Coffee cups balanced on armrests. Presentation screens displayed the Northbridge Holdings logo against a blue background. Caroline entered quietly through the rear doors. She chose a seat near the aisle. Walking had become slower during the final months of pregnancy, but she maintained the same calm posture she carried every day. Several co-workers smiled warmly. "Good morning, Caroline." "You look great. How are you feeling today?" She thanked each of them sincerely. "The baby has been very active." "Just a few more months?" "We're both doing well." The conversations felt ordinary, comforting, human. No one around her sensed that the morning would soon become unforgettable. At precisely 9:30, Benjamin stepped onto the stage. His tailored charcoal suit contrasted sharply against the bright company logo projected behind him. Applause filled the room. Benjamin smiled confidently. "Thank you, everyone." He began with financial results, regional growth, operational efficiency, strategic initiatives. Employees listened attentively. Everything appeared routine. Then his presentation changed. The slide behind him disappeared. The screen became blank. Benjamin folded his notes. "There is one more topic I want to address." The room grew noticeably quieter. "Our company succeeds because accountability matters." He paused. "Policies only have meaning if leadership is willing to enforce them." Caroline looked toward the stage without expression. Benjamin continued. "Too often managers avoid difficult decisions because they worry about appearing insensitive." Several executives nodded. Victoria Sloan sat near the front row, watching quietly. Benjamin took a slow breath. "Today I intend to demonstrate that performance standards apply equally to everyone." Melissa, seated beside the audio technician, already knew what came next. Most employees did not. Benjamin looked toward the audience. "Caroline Rogers." Her name echoed through the auditorium. Conversation stopped instantly. "Would you please come forward?" Hundreds of eyes turned toward her. For one brief moment, nobody moved. Then Caroline stood. She adjusted her maternity blazer carefully before walking toward the stage. Her movements remained steady despite the weight of pregnancy. The only sound inside the enormous auditorium became the quiet rhythm of her footsteps. Benjamin waited with crossed arms. When Caroline reached the front, she stood several feet away from him. She offered a polite smile. "You wanted to see me?" Benjamin never returned the smile. "Yes." He lifted the folder Melissa had prepared. "As Regional Operations Director, I've reviewed your recent performance." Caroline remained silent. "Your productivity has declined." Silence. "You've failed to meet expectations." Silence. "Your department has repeatedly required additional support because of your inability to maintain consistent performance." Several employees exchanged uncomfortable glances. One supervisor quietly whispered to another. "She's pregnant," his colleague answered softly. "I know." Benjamin continued speaking. "Our organization cannot operate on excuses." The word lingered in the air. "Excuses." Caroline lowered one hand gently onto the curve of her stomach, not defensively, almost instinctively. Benjamin noticed. Instead of softening, his voice became firmer. "Pregnancy deserves respect." He paused deliberately. "It does not eliminate professional responsibility." The auditorium became painfully quiet. Some employees stared at the floor. Others looked toward human resources, expecting someone to intervene. No one did. Victoria Sloan remained expressionless. Benjamin removed several papers from the folder. "Effective immediately, your employment with Northbridge Holdings is terminated." No applause, no reaction, only silence. The words seemed almost too cold to belong inside a room filled with people. Caroline accepted the documents without looking down. "I understand." Benjamin appeared almost surprised by her calmness. "Do you have anything you'd like to say?" She looked directly at him. Her voice remained soft enough that everyone leaned forward to hear. "No." Just one word, nothing more. Benjamin seemed dissatisfied. Perhaps he had expected anger, an argument, tears. Instead, he received quiet acceptance. He cleared his throat. "Security." Two uniformed officers approached respectfully. Their expressions revealed obvious discomfort. One of them, an older man named Marcus, spoke gently. "Ma'am, we're supposed to escort you." Caroline gave him a reassuring smile. "You're simply doing your job." Marcus looked embarrassed. "I'm sorry." "There is nothing for you to apologize for." She turned back toward Benjamin. Again she said nothing. No accusations, no reminders that company policy prohibited terminating an employee under these circumstances without documented review. No mention of federal pregnancy protections, no reference to corporate bylaws. Nothing. She simply walked toward the front row seat where her handbag rested. Inside were several personal items, a notebook, a small bottle of water, her prenatal vitamins, a folded baby ultrasound photograph. She carefully placed everything inside her bag. Then she removed her employee identification badge. For several seconds, she studied it quietly. The plastic card had identified her as nothing more than an administrative operations coordinator. No title, no indication of ownership, no hint of authority. She placed the badge on the nearest table. Nearby, Melissa watched with quiet satisfaction. Victoria folded her hands. Benjamin believed the matter finished. They failed to notice one final action. Caroline opened her phone. Using the secure legal archive application previously authorized by Richard Caldwell months earlier, she uploaded several files she had lawfully preserved during the ordinary course of her work. Meeting summaries, policy revisions, internal communications, timestamp verification. Nothing confidential beyond her authorized access. Nothing altered, nothing manipulated. The upload completed in seconds. She locked the phone and slipped it into her purse. Marcus approached again. "We can leave whenever you're ready." Caroline nodded. Together they began walking toward the auditorium doors. Employees slowly stood as she passed. No one clapped, no one spoke. Yet something unexpected happened. A young administrative assistant quietly whispered, "I'm sorry." Then another, "I'm so sorry." A department coordinator lowered her eyes. "You didn't deserve this." Caroline acknowledged each of them with the same gentle nod. "Take care of yourselves." Those were the last words she spoke before reaching the exit. Outside, the bright Manhattan sunlight felt almost unreal after the cold atmosphere inside the auditorium. She inhaled deeply. The baby moved again. She rested one hand against her stomach. "We're all right," she whispered. Behind the glass walls of Northbridge Holdings, Benjamin resumed the quarterly meeting as though nothing extraordinary had happened. He believed he had demonstrated decisive leadership. He believed employees had witnessed strength. He believed the morning marked the beginning of greater authority. He did not know that every camera inside the auditorium had recorded the termination. He did not know that every corporate email connected to the decision remained preserved. He did not know that company policy, federal employment law, and board governance procedures had all been quietly violated before hundreds of witnesses. Most importantly, he still had no idea that the woman who had walked calmly out of the building was the one person with the legal authority to determine whether he would ever again hold an executive office inside Northbridge Holdings. And somewhere inside the company's secure legal archive, another timestamp had just been added to a growing collection of evidence that no speech, no title, and no display of authority would ever be able to erase. The elevator doors closed with a soft chime. For the first time in nearly 4 years, Caroline Rogers was no longer an employee of Northbridge Holdings. She stood alone inside the descending elevator, one hand resting lightly against the polished rail, the other protecting the gentle curve of her stomach. Her breathing remained steady. She did not cry, not because the morning had not hurt. It had. Benjamin's words still echoed in her memory. "Your employment is terminated. Performance standards apply equally to everyone. The company cannot operate on excuses." The humiliation had been public, deliberate, designed to send a message. Yet Caroline understood something Benjamin did not. Public humiliation often became the most reliable witness. By the time the elevator reached the lobby, nearly every security camera inside headquarters had already backed up its recordings to the company's protected archive. She knew the system. She had helped review its compliance policies during her observation period. Nothing from that morning would simply disappear. Marcus, the senior security officer, walked beside her through the marble lobby. Neither spoke for several moments. Employees standing near reception quietly stepped aside. Some looked ashamed, others looked frightened. No one celebrated what had happened upstairs. As they approached the revolving doors, Marcus finally cleared his throat. "Mrs. Rogers." She looked toward him. "I've worked here almost 18 years. His voice carried genuine discomfort. "I've escorted people out before." He hesitated. "But never someone who remained so calm." Caroline smiled gently. "You were respectful. I still wish it hadn't been me. You followed instructions." Marcus lowered his eyes. "I hope things work out for you." Caroline nodded. "So do I." She stepped outside into the warm Manhattan air. The city continued exactly as it always had. Yellow taxis rushed past. Construction crews shouted across the street. Cyclists weaved through traffic. Thousands of strangers hurried toward destinations that had nothing to do with Northbridge Holdings. Life had not stopped simply because hers had changed. She stood quietly for a moment beneath the enormous glass tower. Then she removed her phone. One contact appeared near the top of her favorites list. Richard Caldwell. She pressed call. He answered before the second ring. "I've been expecting your call." His calm voice remained unchanged. "It happened. I know. You've already heard. There were 3 directors attending remotely this morning." Richard paused. The board was informed before the meeting even ended. Caroline looked back toward the building. "I'd like to meet. I'm already arranging it. Today. Immediately," he continued in the same measured tone. "But not at headquarters." "Where?" "Our downtown legal offices. I'll be there in 30 minutes. I'll notify everyone." The call ended. Caroline ordered a taxi. As the vehicle pulled away from Northbridge Holdings, she never once looked back through the rear window. She simply rested both hands over her unborn child. The silence inside the cab felt strangely peaceful. Meanwhile, on the 36th floor, Benjamin accepted congratulations. Several department managers approached after the meeting. "You handled that decisively. Strong leadership. People definitely got the message." Benjamin thanked them modestly. "I simply enforce standards." Victoria Sloan joined the conversation. The organization needed clarity. Benjamin nodded. "I've delayed difficult decisions before." "Not anymore," Victoria smiled approvingly. "Executives earn credibility by making uncomfortable choices." Melissa Grant appeared carrying Benjamin's afternoon schedule. 3 media interviews. Budget review at 2. Leadership dinner tonight. Benjamin adjusted his jacket confidently. A full day. Neither Victoria nor Melissa mentioned Caroline again. To them, the matter had already become history. Several floors below, however, history was only beginning. At 1 o'clock that afternoon, Caroline entered the Manhattan offices of Caldwell, Pierce & Monroe, the law firm that had represented the Rogers family for more than 40 years. The conference room overlooking the Hudson River already contained 3 familiar faces. Richard Caldwell stood first. His silver hair had become almost completely white during the years Caroline had known him. He greeted her warmly. "How are you feeling?" She smiled faintly. "The baby is kicking." "I'll take that as good news." "It is." Richard pulled out a chair for her. "We'll keep today's meeting brief." Moments later, Margaret Whitmore entered carrying several folders. Unlike many corporate directors, Margaret preferred plain navy suits over expensive fashion. She had built her reputation through careful judgment rather than dramatic speeches. Seeing Caroline, she crossed the room immediately. "I'm sorry." Caroline shook her head gently. "Please don't apologize for something you didn't do." Margaret sat beside her. "I watched the recording." "So did I." "It was worse than the summary suggested." Caroline remained silent. Finally, the last attendee arrived, Samuel Foster. The retired federal judge still carried himself with remarkable discipline despite his age. He greeted Caroline with quiet kindness. "Your grandfather would be proud of how you conducted yourself." Those words nearly broke the composure she had maintained all morning, not because they praised her, because they reminded her how much she missed Harold Rogers. Samuel seemed to recognize the emotion immediately. He allowed several seconds of silence before sitting down. Richard opened the meeting. "The purpose today is simple." He looked around the table. "We determine facts. No conclusions. No retaliation. No emotion. Only facts." Caroline nodded. "Agreed." Richard began reviewing events chronologically. At approximately 10:18 this morning, he documented everything. The meeting announcement, witness attendance, Benjamin's statements, termination procedures, security involvement, corporate recordings, HR participation. Each event received a precise timestamp. Margaret occasionally asked questions. "Was a performance improvement plan issued?" Richard answered immediately. "No." "Were written warnings completed?" "No." "Was legal consulted?" "No." "Was the board notified?" "No." Samuel quietly made notes. Finally, he looked toward Caroline. "Do you wish to challenge the termination immediately?" She considered the question carefully. "No." The room became still. Richard adjusted his glasses. "You understand that as controlling shareholder, you have authority to suspend executive decisions today." "I understand. And yet you choose not to." Caroline folded her hands. "I don't want anyone believing ownership places me above procedure." She looked toward each person at the table. "If Benjamin violated company policy," she paused, "the evidence should prove it. If HR violated policy, the evidence should prove it. If executives acted improperly, the evidence should prove it." Richard smiled almost imperceptibly. "Your grandfather said nearly the same thing 20 years ago." Caroline looked toward the window. "He taught me that justice becomes fragile when it depends upon personalities." Samuel nodded approvingly. "And durable when it depends upon process." "Exactly." Richard opened another folder. "Then I recommend the following." He listed each action carefully. Independent outside counsel. No involvement from internal legal staff. Independent forensic accounting. Independent technology review. Independent HR compliance audit. Board oversight through the independent directors. Margaret added another recommendation. All executive communications should receive litigation preservation notices immediately. Richard nodded. "Agreed." Samuel looked toward Caroline. "Any objections?" "None." "Then we proceed." No one celebrated. No one discussed revenge. No one suggested humiliating Benjamin publicly. The conversation remained entirely professional. Nearly 2 hours later, the formal meeting concluded. Richard walked Caroline toward the elevator. "There is one more question." She looked at him. "Personal, rather than legal." "Go ahead. Will you tell Benjamin who you are?" Caroline answered almost immediately. "No." Richard seemed unsurprised. "You want him to discover it himself." "I want him to discover the truth through the proper process." Richard smiled. "That answer sounds exactly like your grandfather." As the elevator doors opened, Caroline spoke quietly. "I didn't marry Benjamin because I owned a company. No, I married him because I believed he respected people." Richard did not respond. Some questions required no answer. Later that afternoon, after returning home, Caroline placed the termination documents inside a simple file cabinet. Not hidden, not displayed, simply stored. She changed into comfortable clothes before attending a routine prenatal appointment with her physician. The baby's heartbeat remained strong. Everything looked healthy. The doctor smiled reassuringly. "Try to avoid unnecessary stress." Caroline almost laughed. "I'll do my best." That evening, Benjamin returned home later than usual. He appeared energized. "The meeting went well." Caroline stood in the kitchen preparing tea. "I'm glad. We're finally moving the company in the right direction." She handed him a cup. "I hope everyone remembers to move together." Benjamin barely noticed the remark. His phone vibrated again. Another executive email. Another meeting. Another opportunity. He disappeared into his office without asking how her doctor's appointment had gone, without asking how the baby was feeling, without asking how she was feeling. Caroline watched the closed office door for several seconds, not with anger, not even disappointment, only quiet understanding. Some distances became too wide long before anyone realized they were walking apart. Across Manhattan, inside secure law offices, litigation hold notices were already being drafted. Outside forensic investigators had accepted their assignments. Independent auditors were assembling their teams. Digital records were being preserved before anyone had the chance to alter them. Benjamin believed the most important event of the day had been a public termination. He could not yet see that the truly important events had begun only after Caroline quietly walked out of the building. And unlike public speeches, legal procedures rarely announced themselves. They simply moved forward patiently, methodically, and without mercy for those who underestimated them. 3 days after Caroline Rogers was publicly dismissed, nothing appeared unusual inside Northbridge Holdings. Employees continued arriving before 8. Conference rooms remained booked from morning until evening. Quarterly forecasts dominated executive discussions. the cafeteria still filled with conversations about deadlines, promotions, and weekend plans. From the outside, the corporation seemed untouched. Beneath the surface, however, an entirely different operation had quietly begun. At exactly 7:00 a.m. on Thursday, 4 outside professionals entered the headquarters through a private executive entrance. None wore company identification badges. Each carried only a laptop case and a visitor credential. Their arrival attracted little attention. They had not come to advise management. They had come to preserve evidence. The engagement had been authorized unanimously by the independent directors under attorney-client privilege. To most employees, they were introduced simply as outside compliance consultants. Only a handful of people knew their true purpose. Richard Caldwell met them briefly in a secure conference room before they separated. "Your responsibility is documentation," he said calmly. "No assumptions. No interviews without counsel. No speculation. If something cannot be verified, it does not belong in the report." Every investigator nodded. The lead forensic technology specialist, Laura Mitchell, opened the first checklist. "Email preservation," Richard answered immediately. "Company-wide litigation hold notices were issued last night. No deletion privileges. Suspended. Automatic retention. Extended indefinitely." Laura closed her notebook. Good. The investigation had officially begun. On the 36th floor, Benjamin Walker remained completely unaware. He was presenting expansion proposals to regional managers with the same confidence he had displayed all week. "The next quarter is about efficiency," he explained. "We'll reward measurable performance." No one interrupted him. No one mentioned the legal notices quietly appearing in executive inboxes that morning. Most executives assumed they related to routine compliance reviews. Benjamin barely read his. He forwarded it to Melissa Grant with one sentence. "Please file." Melissa did exactly that. Neither realized the notice required preservation of every communication connected to personnel decisions, including Caroline's termination. Meanwhile, in the technology department, Laura Mitchell met with Northbridge's Director of Information Security. "We'll need complete server images." He looked surprised. "For which departments?" "Executive leadership, human resources, finance, corporate communications." He hesitated. "That's extensive." Laura smiled politely. "It is." She handed him a signed authorization from outside counsel. "The board has approved everything." The director scanned the document. Every signature was valid. Every authorization complete. He nodded. "We'll begin immediately." Within minutes, secure copies of thousands of emails began downloading onto encrypted storage devices. Nothing changed on employee computers. Nobody noticed. The preservation occurred silently, exactly as intended. Across the building, another investigation unfolded. Outside, employment attorney Angela Moreno occupied a temporary office reviewing human resources files. Boxes arrived steadily throughout the morning. Accommodation requests, medical leave documentation, performance evaluations, termination procedures, pregnancy-related workplace adjustments. Angela examined each file methodically. She looked for one thing: consistency. If company policy had been followed equally, the review would end quickly. Instead, unusual patterns appeared almost immediately. Several pregnant employees had requested modified schedules. Approval denied. Another employee had requested temporary lifting restrictions after surgery. Denied. One department manager had recommended additional remote work options for an expectant mother. Rejected. Yet executives recovering from minor injuries had received immediate accommodations. Angela circled the dates. Then she compared signatures. Victoria Sloan's name appeared repeatedly. Not proof, not yet. Only a pattern requiring further examination. She placed colored tabs on each file: yellow, blue, red. By lunchtime, nearly 40 files carried markers. At the same time, forensic accountants occupied a different conference room. Their responsibilities centered on financial approvals, expense reimbursements, consulting contracts, departmental budgets. Nothing initially appeared suspicious. Then one accountant noticed something unusual. Several consulting invoices approved by Ethan Brooks had bypassed ordinary review procedures. Not illegal, but irregular. Another spreadsheet revealed repeated emergency budget authorizations without documented justification. Again, not proof, Simply another pattern. The accountants continued tracing every approval. One transaction led naturally to another. Caroline knew almost none of these details. By her own request, she received only general updates from Richard Caldwell. She wanted complete separation between ownership and investigation. On Friday morning, she sat in a small neighborhood cafe after finishing a prenatal yoga class recommended by her physician. The instructor had encouraged relaxation, controlled breathing, gentle movement. For one peaceful hour, Caroline had almost forgotten Northbridge Holdings entirely. She stirred herbal tea while reading a parenting book. Her phone vibrated once. "Richard," she answered quietly. "Good morning. The investigation has begun smoothly. I'm glad. There may be interview requests soon. For me, no." Richard paused. "Employees." Caroline looked through the cafe window toward families walking along the sidewalk. "I hope they don't feel pressured. We've emphasized voluntary participation." "Good. There is one more thing." She waited. "The investigators are impressed." "With what?" "The amount of documentation already available." Caroline lowered her eyes. "I only kept notes." "You kept facts." Richard corrected her gently. "Facts matter." After ending the call, Caroline returned to her book. The chapter discussed preparing emotionally for motherhood. It reminded readers that children often learned more from observation than instruction. She smiled faintly. Adults weren't very different. Back at headquarters, nervous conversations quietly began spreading, not openly, never in large groups, only whispers. Two payroll specialists noticed outside consultants requesting archived files. A technology analyst mentioned unusual server backups. An HR coordinator wondered why old accommodation requests had suddenly become important. Nobody possessed enough information to understand the whole picture, but uncertainty grew. Inside her office, Victoria Sloan attempted to dismiss concerns. "It's routine." One HR manager looked unconvinced. "They've requested 6 years of records. Compliance reviews happen. They've never happened like this." Victoria maintained her composed smile. "Continue your work." After the manager left, however, Victoria immediately closed her office door. For the first time all week, she looked uneasy. She opened her email. Litigation hold, outside counsel, independent review, mandatory preservation. The language felt unusually formal. She reread the notice twice, then deleted nothing. For once, experience told her caution mattered more than confidence. Elsewhere, Ethan Brooks experienced a similar reaction. A forensic accountant requested supporting documentation for several consulting approvals. Perfectly ordinary. Except they had asked for documents dating back almost 3 years. Why, he couldn't answer. He instructed his assistant to retrieve every file exactly as requested. "Should we organize them?" "No." "Highlight anything?" "No." He paused. "Give them exactly what they asked for." His assistant nodded. Ethan leaned back after she left. The investigation felt broader than anyone had anticipated. Benjamin noticed none of it. His calendar remained full. Interviews, budget meetings, regional calls, leadership dinners. He interpreted the growing tension around headquarters differently. People were becoming more disciplined. Exactly as he intended. During Friday afternoon's executive meeting, he even remarked, "The organization feels more focused this week." Melissa smiled immediately. People respect decisive leadership. Victoria forced a smile. "So it seems." Only Ethan remained unusually quiet. Benjamin assumed he was simply tired. Late that evening, after most employees had gone home, Laura Mitchell completed the first phase of digital preservation. She reviewed the secure evidence log, executive email archives. Complete. Meeting calendar records. Complete. Internal messaging history. Complete. Security camera metadata. Complete. She paused at one final folder. Quarterly operations meeting, date, time, auditorium. Multiple synchronized camera angles. Without opening the recordings, she verified the digital integrity hash. Everything matched. No alterations, no corruption. The footage remained exactly as recorded. She locked the encrypted drive inside a tamper-evident case before signing the chain of custody form. Evidence preserved. Properly. Legally. Reliably. That same night, Carolyn stood on the balcony outside her apartment. The city lights stretched endlessly beneath the summer sky. inside the nursery was slowly taking shape. A crib had arrived that afternoon. Benjamin had not yet assembled it. He said work had been too busy. Caroline didn't complain. She quietly unfolded tiny baby clothes instead. The child moved gently again. She smiled. "No matter what happens," she whispered softly, "you'll grow up knowing that kindness is never weakness." She looked toward the distant skyline where Northbridge Holdings stood among dozens of glittering towers. The building appeared unchanged, strong, permanent, untouchable. Appearances she had learned long ago rarely told the entire story. Inside secure servers, inside archived emails, inside preserved financial records, inside carefully documented HR files, the truth was slowly assembling itself, not because anyone wished for revenge, but because facts possessed a remarkable quality. When protected with patience, they eventually spoke for themselves. A week after Caroline Rogers left Northbridge Holdings, the atmosphere inside the executive offices had changed in ways that no quarterly report could measure. Nothing dramatic had happened. No emergency announcement had been made. No executive had been suspended. Business continued. Meetings filled every calendar. Clients signed contracts. Construction projects moved forward. Stock market analysts praised the company's latest expansion strategy. Yet beneath that polished exterior, uncertainty had begun replacing confidence. People who once walked quickly through executive hallways now slowed outside conference rooms. Conversations stopped when unfamiliar consultants appeared. Doors that had always remained open were quietly closed. The corporation still functioned. It simply no longer felt comfortable. Benjamin Walker noticed the tension but interpreted it as proof that his leadership was working. Fear, he believed, encouraged discipline. He had repeated that idea so often over the past month that it had become part of his management philosophy. During Monday's regional leadership conference call, he addressed nearly 60 department managers. "Our responsibility is consistency." He clicked to the next presentation slide. "Employees perform best when expectations are clear." Several managers nodded. Others remained expressionless. Benjamin continued, "If difficult decisions make leaders uncomfortable, they probably aren't making enough of them." The statement received polite agreement. No one challenged him, not because everyone agreed, because nobody wanted unnecessary attention. After the meeting ended, Melissa Grant followed Benjamin into his office carrying a stack of documents. "You handled that well," Benjamin smiled. "I think they're finally beginning to understand." "They definitely are." Melissa organized the paperwork neatly across his desk. "I've also noticed something." "What?" "People seem much more careful around you." Benjamin interpreted the observation positively. "They're taking accountability seriously." Melissa hesitated for only a moment. Perhaps. She chose not to mention that several managers had privately begun requesting written confirmation before following executive instructions. Fear did encourage caution, just not always in the direction Benjamin imagined. Meanwhile, on another floor, Victoria Sloan faced a meeting she had hoped would never happen. Outside employment attorney Angela Moreno requested a formal interview regarding human resources procedures. Victoria entered the conference room carrying several policy manuals. Angela greeted her professionally. "Thank you for making time." "Of course," Victoria smiled confidently. "I'm always happy to support compliance reviews." Angela returned the smile. "I appreciate that." A recorder sat quietly on the conference table. Angela pressed one button. "The purpose of today's interview is fact-gathering." Victoria nodded. "Understood." For the record, did Human Resources approve the termination of Caroline Rogers? "Yes." "What documentation supported that decision?" Victoria opened one folder. "Performance concerns." Angela reviewed the documents carefully. "I don't see a formal performance improvement plan." "There wasn't one." "Any written coaching?" "No." "Documented disciplinary warnings?" Victoria paused. "No." Angela looked up. "Company policy requires those steps before involuntary termination, correct?" Victoria folded her hands. "In most situations." "What made this situation different?" Victoria considered her answer. "Executive judgment." Angela made one brief note. Nothing more. No accusation, no raised voice, just another fact added to the growing record. Across the hall, forensic accountants continued examining financial approvals connected to Ethan Brooks. The work had become painstaking. Every invoice, every electronic authorization, every emergency expenditure. Hours passed with almost nothing unusual. Then one junior accountant noticed duplicate consulting payments issued under different project codes. The amounts were modest, individually insignificant, collectively less so. He handed the spreadsheet to his supervisor. Probably an accounting error. The supervisor examined the numbers. Maybe. She compared approval signatures. Every authorization traced back to Ethan Brooks. Again, not proof of misconduct, but enough to justify additional review. Another colored tab appeared inside another growing file. Caroline spent Monday afternoon attending a childbirth education class at a nearby medical center. The room contained 8 expectant couples. Benjamin had intended to come. A last-minute executive meeting changed those plans. He texted 30 minutes before class began. "I'm sorry. Important meeting. Next time." Caroline read the message, then placed her phone inside her purse. She answered simply, "Take care." Nothing more. The instructor spent nearly 2 hours discussing breathing techniques, labor preparation, and newborn care. Partners practiced supporting mothers during contractions. Caroline completed every exercise alone. Another expectant father quietly noticed. During a short break, he approached politely. "My wife asked if you'd like to join us for coffee afterward." Caroline smiled warmly. "That's kind of you." "You shouldn't have to leave alone." She looked toward the couple across the room. The woman smiled gently. Caroline accepted. For 45 peaceful minutes, they discussed baby names, sleepless nights, and parenting books. Nobody asked about corporate politics. Nobody mentioned Northbridge Holdings. It felt refreshing. Before leaving, the woman touched Caroline's arm softly. "You're going to be a wonderful mother." Caroline thanked her. Sometimes encouragement carried greater weight when offered by strangers. At headquarters, Melissa Grant noticed something unusual. Several executives who previously visited Benjamin's office daily had quietly reduced contact. One postponed a meeting. Another requested video conferences instead of private discussions. A third suddenly insisted that legal counsel attend future personnel reviews. Melissa mentioned the change. "I think people are becoming overly cautious." Benjamin laughed lightly. "That's not necessarily bad. They're documenting everything. So should we." Melissa nodded. Although she agreed outwardly, uneasiness continued growing inside her. The litigation hold notices remained active. Outside investigators still occupied conference rooms. Something larger than routine compliance was clearly happening. She simply couldn't determine what. That afternoon, Ethan Brooks received another request. This time, investigators wanted archived procurement committee meeting recordings. Not minutes. Recordings. His pulse quickened slightly. Most meetings had been recorded automatically for administrative purposes. Few executives ever reviewed them afterward. He called information technology. Do those recordings still exist? They're retained automatically. For how long? 7 years. Ethan thanked the technician before ending the call. He leaned back slowly. Nothing had been deleted. Nothing had disappeared. Every discussion still existed exactly as spoken. Near the end of this workday, Benjamin stopped by Victoria Sloane's office. "How's the compliance review going?" Victoria answered carefully. "More detailed than expected. They'll finish eventually. I'm sure." Benjamin noticed stacks of open files covering her desk. "Anything I should worry about?" Victoria forced a reassuring smile. "No." He accepted the answer without further questions. After he left, Victoria remained seated for several minutes. She had not lied, not exactly. She simply no longer knew what anyone should worry about. Wednesday morning brought another unexpected development. Anonymous employee interviews began. Participation remained voluntary. No supervisors attended. No executive received advance notice regarding who accepted invitations. Inside a temporary interview room, Angela Moreno greeted each employee exactly the same way. "We're interested in facts. No opinions, no assumptions. If you don't remember something clearly, please say so." One employee described denied accommodation requests. Another recalled unusual pressure during performance evaluations. A department coordinator remembered Benjamin discussing the importance of making visible examples. Someone else mentioned concerns about retaliation after raising policy questions. Each interview lasted less than an hour. Each ended with the same statement: "Thank you for your honesty." No promises, no conclusions, only documentation. Late that afternoon, Benjamin encountered something that genuinely surprised him. While walking through the operations department, conversations stopped almost immediately. Employees greeted him politely, then returned quietly to their work. Nobody lingered. Nobody volunteered updates. Nobody joked casually as they once had. The respect felt different, colder, more distant. Benjamin interpreted the silence as professionalism. He failed to recognize another possibility. Trust had begun disappearing. Respect based upon fear often looked convincing, until examined closely. That evening, Caroline organized the nursery at home. Benjamin had still not assembled the crib. She carefully unfolded tiny blankets instead. A gentle knock interrupted her thoughts. Richard Caldwell stood outside carrying a flat cardboard package. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all." He stepped inside. "I brought something." He handed her the package. Inside rested an old leather journal. Caroline recognized it instantly. Her grandfather's handwriting covered the first page. Harold Rogers, Leadership Notes. Richard smiled. "He asked me to give this to you only after your observation period became unexpectedly difficult." Caroline carefully opened the first page. One sentence had been underlined decades earlier. "The greatest temptation of power is believing it excuses ordinary decency." She quietly read it again, then again. Richard watched without speaking. Finally, she looked up. He knew. He understood people, Richard corrected gently. He knew success often reveals what comfort keeps hidden. Caroline closed the journal carefully. "I wish I could ask him what to do now." Richard smiled softly. "I suspect he already answered." She glanced toward the underlined sentence once more. Perhaps he had. Across Manhattan, secure databases continued expanding. Interview transcripts accumulated, financial analyses deepened, email timelines lengthened. Technology experts verified digital records. No headlines appeared. No dramatic confrontations occurred. Only patient, methodical work. Benjamin still believed the greatest challenge facing Northbridge Holdings involved increasing efficiency. He did not yet understand that another measure of leadership was quietly being evaluated. Not by quarterly profits, not by productivity charts, but by integrity. And unlike performance statistics, integrity could not be improved through presentations. It either existed, or the evidence eventually proved it did not. 10 days after Caroline Rogers was dismissed, the first preliminary investigation reports reached the independent directors of Northbridge Holdings. No announcements were made, no executive received copies. The reports were marked confidential attorney-client, privileged, and delivered directly to a private board conference room on the 42nd floor, a floor so rarely used that many employees did not even know it existed. The room overlooked the Hudson River, but none of the directors paid attention to the view. Folders nearly 3 inches thick rested in front of every seat. Richard Caldwell stood at one end of the polished oak table. Margaret Whitmore sat beside him. Judge Samuel Foster quietly reviewed handwritten notes before the meeting officially began. Around them, 7 independent directors settled into their chairs. Richard waited until the doors were closed. "Good morning." His voice remained calm. "Today's purpose is not to determine guilt." He looked around the room. "Our responsibility is to review whether sufficient evidence exists to continue the formal investigation." Every director nodded. Richard opened the first folder. "The preliminary findings are divided into 4 categories." He raised one finger. "Corporate governance." A second. "Human resources compliance." A third. "Financial authorization." Finally, "executive conduct." He deliberately avoided mentioning names. Not yet. Facts would come first. For nearly 2 hours, the directors reviewed timelines, organizational charts, policy manuals, and documented procedures. Richard spoke with the precision of someone who had spent 4 decades inside corporate law. The termination of Caroline Rogers appears to have bypassed mandatory procedural safeguards. He clicked to another slide. No documented performance improvement plan. Another. No written disciplinary process. Another. No legal consultation. Another. No board notification. Silence filled the room. Margaret Whitmore finally spoke. "Is there any evidence these omissions resulted from administrative oversight?" Richard answered immediately. "None identified." Samuel Foster quietly added, "The documentation instead suggests deliberate acceleration." One director frowned. "Accelerated by whom?" Richard closed the folder. "The investigation remains ongoing." "We are not assigning responsibility today." Again, facts before conclusions. The philosophy never changed. Several floors below, Benjamin Walker walked confidently into another executive strategy meeting. The atmosphere felt noticeably different. Conversations stopped more often when he entered. Executives smiled politely but briefly. Several legal representatives attended meetings that previously required none. Benjamin assumed the corporation had become unusually cautious after recent organizational changes. He considered that a positive development. As everyone settled around the conference table, Benjamin outlined ambitious expansion proposals. "We're positioned for aggressive growth." He projected revenue charts onto the screen. "Our operational efficiencies create opportunities competitors simply don't have." Normally, executives interrupted with questions. Today they listened quietly, not because they disagreed, because many had become distracted by something else. Every executive present had received at least one request from outside investigators during the previous week. Some had provided emails, others supplied meeting notes. Several participated in recorded interviews. Nobody knew how extensive the review had become. Nobody knew who else had been interviewed. Uncertainty spread more efficiently than rumors ever could. Benjamin interpreted the silence as agreement. He continued presenting confidently. Later that afternoon, Victoria Sloan received another invitation from Angela Moreno. Not a request. An invitation. This interview focused specifically on pregnancy accommodation policies. Victoria entered carrying additional documents. Angela greeted her professionally. "Thank you for returning." Victoria forced a smile. "I understand you have more questions." "I do." Angela opened a policy handbook. Section 8.4. She turned the book toward Victoria. "What does this policy require regarding pregnancy accommodations?" Victoria read aloud. "Managers must engage in an interactive process with employees requesting reasonable workplace adjustments." "Did that occur with Caroline Rogers?" Victoria hesitated. "No." "Why not?" "The decision," she paused, "was considered operationally urgent." Angela waited. Nothing more. Silence often encouraged more honest answers than confrontation. Victoria finally continued. "Benjamin believed immediate action demonstrated leadership." Angela wrote down the exact sentence. No interpretation, no commentary. Just the words exactly as spoken. Another fact, another page, another carefully preserved record. Across the building, forensic technology specialists completed analysis of internal communications. Laura Mitchell reviewed thousands of emails exchanged among executives during the weeks leading to Caroline's dismissal. Most discussed ordinary business, budgets, travel schedules, department updates. Then one conversation drew her attention. Benjamin had written to Melissa Grant. "The meeting needs a clear example," Melissa replied. "HR already has someone in mind." Minutes later, Victoria responded, "We'll prepare everything before Thursday." The messages contained no explicit wrongdoing, yet together they established chronology, planning, coordination, intent. Laura flagged the exchange for legal review. She did not speculate about meaning. That responsibility belonged elsewhere. Meanwhile, Caroline's world looked remarkably different. She spent Tuesday morning assembling baby clothes by size. Tiny socks, soft blankets, newborn pajamas. The nursery slowly transformed from an empty room into a place waiting for new life. The peaceful work felt strangely healing. Around noon, Margaret Whitmore called. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all." "I wanted to update you personally." Caroline sat beside the nursery window. "How is everyone?" "The board remains unified. They're following the process. Very carefully." Margaret smiled softly through the phone. "You would approve." Caroline laughed quietly. "I wasn't worried. There is something else." She waited. Several directors commented on your restraint. Caroline looked toward the small wooden crib Benjamin still had not assembled. I haven't done anything. Exactly. Margaret's voice carried genuine admiration. Many owners would have intervened immediately. I don't own justice, Caroline answered calmly. I only have a responsibility to protect it. Margaret remained silent for several seconds. Your grandfather once said almost the same thing. After ending the call, Caroline returned to folding tiny baby blankets. She never asked which directors had praised her. She never asked what they thought about Benjamin. Those questions no longer mattered. Wednesday morning brought another development inside headquarters. Several middle managers requested written clarification before approving new disciplinary actions. Human resources suddenly required additional documentation. Termination decisions slowed. Supervisors began reviewing policies more carefully than ever before. No executive instructed them to change. Fear of making mistakes accomplished what training often failed to achieve. Benjamin noticed the increased paperwork. During an afternoon meeting, he frowned. When did our managers become afraid of making decisions? A department director answered cautiously. I think people just want everything documented. Benjamin shook his head. Leadership requires confidence. The director smiled politely. It also requires records. Benjamin considered the answer, then moved on. He failed to recognize how significantly the organizational culture had shifted in only 2 weeks. People no longer trusted verbal instructions. Everything needed documentation. Everything needed timestamps. Everything needed signatures. Because nobody knew what investigators might examine next. That evening, Richard Caldwell met privately with Samuel Foster. Stacks of investigative summaries covered the conference table. Samuel removed his reading glasses. What concerns you most? Richard answered honestly. The consistency. Samuel nodded. I noticed that too. If this were one isolated mistake, it would look different. Richard finished the thought. But patterns carry their own weight. Samuel opened another folder. The employee interviews concern me. They're remarkably similar. Without appearing rehearsed, Richard agreed. They describe the same management philosophy using different words. Samuel leaned back thoughtfully. Fear. Richard nodded. Yes. The culture appears to have shifted toward fear. Samuel quietly closed the folder. That usually begins at the top. Neither man mentioned Benjamin by name. There was still time. Evidence first, conclusions later. On Thursday afternoon, Benjamin prepared for an upcoming leadership dinner with potential investors. Melissa adjusted his schedule. Everything's confirmed. Excellent. She hesitated. One thing. What? Outside counsel requested copies of next month's executive meeting calendar. Benjamin looked puzzled. For what reason? They didn't say. He shrugged. Probably another compliance review. Melissa nodded, though the answer failed to reassure her. Increasingly ordinary explanations no longer felt sufficient. That same evening, Caroline attended another prenatal appointment. Her physician smiled after completing the examination. Everything looks excellent. The baby's heartbeat is strong. Growth is exactly where we want it. Caroline released a quiet breath. That's wonderful. The doctor looked at her chart. How's your stress level? She thought carefully before answering. Lower than I expected, the doctor smiled. Sometimes accepting what we cannot immediately change is healthier than fighting every battle. Caroline left the office carrying a printed ultrasound image. For several minutes she sat alone on a nearby park bench watching children play. None of them cared about corporations, board meetings, legal investigations, executive titles. Children understood something adults often forgot. Presence mattered more than status. Kindness lasted longer than authority. She slipped the ultrasound photograph carefully into her purse. Soon another life would depend entirely upon the example she chose to set. As darkness settled over Manhattan, lights continued glowing inside Northbridge Holdings. Investigators worked late. Attorneys reviewed transcripts. Technology specialists verified digital evidence. Financial analysts reconciled transactions. Independent directors prepared for another confidential meeting. Benjamin still believed the greatest challenge before him involved expanding the company's operations. He had no idea the board was preparing for something entirely different. Not an expansion meeting, not a budget review, not a strategic planning session. A formal proceeding that would examine every important decision leading to one quiet morning when a pregnant employee had been publicly humiliated before hundreds of witnesses. And with each passing day, the question before the board became less about what had happened. The evidence had already begun answering that. The real question was becoming who would ultimately be held responsible when every documented fact was finally placed together in one room. 2 weeks had passed since Caroline Rogers walked out of Northbridge Holdings with nothing but a handbag, a notebook, and the quiet dignity Benjamin Walker had failed to take from her. The company continued operating. Quarterly targets were still being met. Construction projects continued across multiple states. Investors remained confident. To anyone reading financial headlines, Northbridge appeared stronger than ever. Yet Benjamin had begun noticing something he could not explain. His influence still existed. His certainty did not. It began with small moments. A vice president who usually returned calls within minutes suddenly replied the following day. A regional director who once eagerly sought Benjamin's approval started copying legal on routine emails. Department managers increasingly requested written instructions before implementing staffing decisions. None of these changes seemed dramatic on their own. Together, however, they formed a pattern Benjamin could no longer ignore. One Monday morning, he entered the executive lounge expecting the usual conversations before the weekly leadership meeting. Instead, several executives looked up briefly before lowering their voices. Someone folded a document as he approached. Another excused herself almost immediately. Only Melissa Grant remained seated. Benjamin poured himself coffee. "Everyone seems busy." Melissa forced a polite smile. "It has been a demanding couple of weeks." He looked around the room. "Or maybe people are avoiding something." Melissa chose her words carefully. "The compliance review has everyone a little cautious." Benjamin laughed softly. "They're acting like someone's preparing for a criminal investigation." No one laughed with him. The silence lingered long enough for Benjamin to notice. He took another sip of coffee. For the first time, the quiet around him felt unfamiliar, not respectful, careful. Across the city, Caroline sat in a brightly lit medical office waiting for another routine prenatal examination. The waiting room walls displayed photographs of newborn babies sent by grateful parents over the years. A young couple sat nearby debating possible names for their daughter. An elderly grandmother knitted a tiny yellow blanket while waiting with her pregnant daughter. Life moved forward with remarkable simplicity. When the nurse called Caroline's name, she smiled and followed her into the examination room. Her physician, Dr. Allison Pierce, greeted her warmly. "How have you been feeling?" "Better. Sleeping. A little. Eating well." Caroline nodded. "The baby's been very active." The ultrasound monitor soon filled with moving images. A tiny heartbeat echoed through the room. Strong, steady, healthy. Dr. Pierce smiled. "Everything looks wonderful." Caroline released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "I'm glad." The doctor studied her chart for another moment. "I know you've experienced significant stress recently." Caroline smiled faintly. "I've had quieter months." Dr. Pierce returned the smile. "Your blood pressure is improving." "That's good. It tells me you're managing the stress better than many people would." Caroline looked toward the monitor where her child continued moving peacefully. "I've realized something." "What?" "I can't choose how people behave." She rested one hand over her stomach. "But I can choose what my child learns from watching me." The doctor nodded thoughtfully. "That's probably the healthiest answer I've heard all week." Meanwhile, inside Northbridge Holdings, the investigation quietly entered another stage. Outside counsel completed dozens of employee interviews. Technology specialists finalized email preservation. Financial auditors finished reconciling executive approvals. Now investigators began comparing everything together. One timeline, one sequence, one story supported entirely by documentation. Angela Moreno met with Richard Caldwell in a secure conference room. She placed 3 folders on the table. "The witness statements." Richard opened the first folder. "What stands out?" Angela answered immediately. "Consistency." She slid several interview summaries across the table. Employees from different departments described the same management style. Richard read silently. Public criticism, fear of disagreement, pressure to avoid questioning executives, retaliation after raising concerns, different employees, different offices, different dates. The descriptions remained remarkably similar. Angela continued. Nobody appears to have coordinated their stories. They don't need to, Richard answered quietly. The facts are coordinating themselves. Angela nodded. Exactly. Benjamin spent Tuesday afternoon preparing for another board presentation. Although only a handful of directors would attend, he intended to propose expanding operational authority across additional regions. Melissa reviewed the presentation one final time. It looks strong. I think so. She hesitated. There's something I've been meaning to ask. Benjamin looked up. What? Have you heard anything else about Caroline? He frowned. No. I was just wondering. Benjamin leaned back in his chair. She's probably looking for another administrative position. Melissa studied his expression carefully. You don't seem worried. Should I be? She almost answered. Instead, she looked away. I don't know. Benjamin closed the presentation. She'll be fine. His confidence sounded genuine. Yet, after Melissa left, he remained seated much longer than usual. He suddenly realized he had not spoken to Caroline properly in nearly 2 weeks. They still lived in the same apartment. They still shared meals occasionally, but meaningful conversations had disappeared. Most evenings he worked late. When he returned home, Caroline was often reading in the nursery or organizing baby clothes. Neither mentioned the company. Neither mentioned the termination. The silence between them had become strangely polite, almost formal. That evening, Benjamin arrived home shortly before 8. The apartment smelled faintly of vegetable soup. Caroline stood at the kitchen counter slicing fruit. She looked up as he entered. How was your day? Busy, she smiled gently. Dinner's almost ready. Benjamin loosened his tie. You didn't have to cook. I wanted to. They ate quietly. Not awkwardly, simply quietly. After several minutes, Benjamin finally spoke. How was your appointment yesterday? Caroline looked mildly surprised. It went well. The baby? Healthy. I'm glad. Another silence followed. Benjamin looked around the apartment. The nursery door stood open. The crib still remained inside its unopened box. He noticed it for the first time in several days. I'll put that together this weekend. Caroline nodded. Whenever you have time. Her answer carried no accusation, no disappointment, just acceptance. Oddly, that acceptance unsettled Benjamin more than criticism might have. He wanted an argument, an emotional reaction, something to prove the distance between them could still be crossed. Instead, Caroline simply continued eating dinner peacefully. The conversation ended there. On Wednesday morning, Victoria Sloan entered another interview with Angela Moreno. This session focused on executive communications surrounding Caroline's termination. Angela placed printed emails on the table. Do you recognize these? Victoria nodded. Yes. You advised Mr. Walker regarding the timing of the termination. I discussed procedural logistics. Angela turned another page. You also wrote, she read directly from the email. We'll prepare everything before Thursday. Victoria sighed quietly. Yes. What did everything refer to? The paperwork. Any legal review? No. Any consultation with the board? No. Angela made another note. Victoria finally asked the question she had been avoiding for days. How serious is this investigation? Angela looked at her calmly. I can't discuss ongoing legal conclusions. But personally, Angela interrupted gently, my personal opinions don't matter. She closed the folder. The evidence does. Later that afternoon, Ethan Brooks experienced his own moment of uncertainty. One forensic accountant requested clarification regarding consulting invoices approved 18 months earlier. Ethan explained each transaction carefully. The accountant thanked him. Nothing accusatory, nothing confrontational. Yet Ethan left the meeting deeply unsettled. He had answered every question honestly. Still, why were they asking now? What exactly were they building? That evening, Richard Caldwell visited Caroline briefly. He found her sitting on the nursery floor organizing children's books. She smiled warmly. I've almost finished. Richard looked around. The room looks beautiful. I wanted it ready before the baby's arrival. He nodded. There are updates. She waited quietly. The investigation is progressing faster than expected. Good. Several executives appear increasingly nervous. Caroline continued arranging books alphabetically. I expected that. Richard studied her for a moment. You really aren't curious, she smiled. I trust the process. Richard laughed softly. Sometimes I forget you're the youngest person involved. My grandfather used to say patience is easier when you know truth doesn't expire. Richard's smile faded into thoughtful silence. He was right. Before leaving, he paused at the nursery door. The board is beginning to discuss scheduling formal proceedings. Caroline looked up. When? Soon, she nodded once. I'll be ready. Across Manhattan, Benjamin stood alone in his office long after sunset. The executive floor had grown almost silent. Cleaning crews vacuumed distant hallways. City lights reflected against the enormous windows behind him. His phone displayed tomorrow's calendar, board presentation, budget review, investor conference call. Everything appeared ordinary. Yet something continued bothering him. He couldn't identify it. No accusation had been made. No disciplinary meeting had been scheduled. No executive had questioned his authority directly. Still, the company no longer felt the same. People smiled less. Conversations ended sooner. Every email seemed unusually formal. Every meeting included additional documentation. Every decision required another signature. Benjamin stared across the skyline. For the first time since becoming regional operations director, confidence gave way to a feeling he had not experienced in years. Uncertainty. He told himself it would pass. He believed stronger leadership would restore order. He had no way of knowing that elsewhere in the city, attorneys were organizing evidence into a single chronological presentation. Each email, each witness statement, each policy, each timestamp, each recorded decision. Individually, they looked ordinary. Together, they were beginning to reveal a story far larger than Benjamin had ever imagined. And before long, he would discover that the most dangerous mistakes were rarely the loudest ones. They were the quiet decisions made with complete confidence that no one important was watching. 3 weeks after Caroline Rogers was publicly dismissed, the investigation entered its final stage. The work was no longer about collecting information. It was about connecting it. Inside a secure conference room at Caldwell Pierce and Monroe, one entire wall had been transformed into a timeline. Not a dramatic display covered with photographs and red strings, simply rows of carefully organized documents. Every page had a date, every email had a timestamp, every meeting had supporting records, every decision pointed naturally toward the next. Richard Caldwell stood quietly, studying the wall. After 42 years practicing corporate law, he had learned that complicated cases rarely depended upon dramatic discoveries. They depended upon ordinary facts arranged in their proper order. Angela Moreno entered carrying another folder. The final witness summaries. Richard accepted it. Anything unexpected? No. She smiled faintly. And that's exactly what makes them persuasive. Richard understood immediately. No sensational accusations, no emotional exaggerations, only consistency. He opened the folder. Employee after employee described the same sequence. Pressure to meet unrealistic expectations. Growing fear of questioning executive decisions. Increasing reluctance to report policy concerns. Public criticism replacing private coaching. The names changed. The departments changed. The wording changed. The pattern remained. Angela sat across from him. I've reviewed every interview twice. And I stopped looking for contradictions. Richard raised an eyebrow. Because there weren't any. Because the differences actually strengthened credibility. She pointed toward several transcripts. Different people remembered different details. But the important facts matched. Richard nodded. That's usually how genuine memories work. Neither attorney celebrated. Professional investigations did not reward excitement. They rewarded accuracy. Across the city, forensic technology specialist Laura Mitchell completed her digital evidence report. She connected her laptop to a secure monitor and reviewed the final verification checklist. Executive email archive, authenticated. Human Resources Communications, authenticated. Internal Messaging History, authenticated. Building Security Records, authenticated. Meeting Recordings, authenticated. Nothing had been altered. Nothing had disappeared. Nothing suggested anyone had attempted to manipulate electronic evidence after litigation preservation began. Laura attached one final certification: digital integrity confirmed. Then she carried the report to Richard's office. He read the conclusion carefully. So every electronic record is reliable. Laura nodded. As reliable as current forensic standards allow. What about deleted material? We recovered almost everything. Almost. A few personal messages had already exceeded routine retention periods months before the investigation. Richard considered that acceptable. They weren't relevant. No, she smiled. The important records were preserved automatically. Richard thanked her. Sometimes the most valuable evidence came not from extraordinary technology, but from ordinary corporate systems functioning exactly as designed. Meanwhile, forensic accountants reached similar conclusions. The duplicate consulting approvals connected to Ethan Brooks proved troubling but ultimately unrelated to Caroline's termination. Administrative weaknesses existed. Documentation procedures required improvement. Some approvals had bypassed recommended review. Yet investigators found no evidence linking those financial issues to the employment decisions under examination. Richard appreciated the distinction. The purpose of the investigation was truth, not expanding allegations beyond available evidence. Ethan Brooks might eventually face separate internal review, but that process would remain independent. Justice required discipline, not convenience. On Thursday morning, Benjamin Walker received an invitation from the corporate secretary. Board governance review attendance required. The meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday. Benjamin barely reacted. Executive governance reviews occurred occasionally. He assumed the discussion involved regional restructuring or updated compliance procedures. Melissa entered his office moments later. "I saw the calendar invitation." Benjamin nodded. "Probably another policy discussion." Melissa looked uncertain. "Maybe." She hesitated. "Have you noticed the board has been meeting more often lately?" "I've been busy." "So have they." Benjamin smiled confidently. "They're preparing for next year's expansion." Melissa wanted to believe him. Instead, she quietly returned to her desk. The explanation no longer felt convincing. That evening, Caroline attended another childbirth preparation class. This time, Benjamin arrived, barely. He entered 15 minutes late, apologizing quietly before taking the empty chair beside her. The instructor welcomed him politely. "We're practicing newborn care tonight." Benjamin smiled awkwardly. "I'll try to catch up." Throughout the class, they learned how to hold an infant, safely recognize feeding cues, and calm a crying newborn. Benjamin struggled wrapping a practice blanket around the doll. Caroline gently adjusted one corner. "Like this." He smiled. "You always make everything look easier." She looked down at the small doll resting in his arms. "No. I've just had more practice." The answer carried no criticism, only patience. After class ended, they walked slowly toward the parking garage. For several minutes, neither spoke. Finally, Benjamin broke the silence. "I've been thinking." Caroline looked toward him. "About us." She waited. "I know work has taken too much of my attention." She remained quiet. "I'll do better." Caroline stopped walking. The evening air felt warm. City traffic echoed beyond the hospital entrance. She answered carefully. "I hope you do." Benjamin searched her face. "That's all." She smiled gently. "I don't want promises." "What do you want?" She looked down at her wedding ring. "Consistency." Benjamin nodded slowly. "I understand." But as they drove home separately, he realized he wasn't entirely certain that he did. Friday morning began with another confidential board meeting. Margaret Whitmore addressed the independent directors. "The investigation is substantially complete." Several directors reviewed the executive summary before them. Richard Caldwell outlined the remaining steps. "We now move from investigation to governance." He projected the proposed agenda: review documented evidence, confirm procedural findings, provide opportunity for executive response, determine organizational action. Everything would occur according to corporate bylaws. Every participant would receive legal representation if requested. Every document would be disclosed appropriately. No surprises, no theatrics. One director asked quietly, "And Mrs. Rogers?" Richard answered, "She will attend only when formally introduced." Another director nodded, "As controlling shareholder." "Correct." The room fell silent. Although every director already knew Caroline's identity, saying the words aloud somehow made the approaching meeting feel more significant. For weeks they had discussed evidence. Soon they would discuss accountability. Later that afternoon, Richard visited Caroline again. She welcomed him into the apartment with tea. The nursery now looked complete. Books lined the shelves, tiny clothes hung neatly inside the closet. The crib finally stood assembled. Richard noticed it immediately. "I see Benjamin found time." Caroline smiled. "He did. He seems to be trying." "He does." Richard studied her expression. "You sound grateful." "I am." He hesitated. "But—" Caroline rested one hand against the crib. "Trying after damage isn't the same as preventing it." Richard remained silent. She continued softly, "I don't hate Benjamin. I know. I just don't recognize the person he's become." Richard nodded. "Sometimes ambition changes people." Caroline looked toward the window. "I don't think ambition changed him." Richard waited. "I think power simply removed the reasons he used to hide certain parts of himself." Those words stayed with Richard long after he left. Monday arrived. The day before the scheduled board governance review. Across headquarters, executives noticed unusual activity. Conference rooms were reserved exclusively for directors. Outside legal counsel arrived carrying sealed document cases. Technology staff tested presentation equipment. Security personnel received updated visitor lists. No explanation accompanied any of it. Speculation spread quietly. Benjamin remained calm. He spent the afternoon rehearsing his quarterly operational achievements. Revenue increases, cost reductions, regional performance. He expected praise, perhaps questions. Nothing more. Before leaving the office, he glanced once toward the large framed mission statement hanging outside the executive suite. Integrity, accountability, respect. He had walked past those words hundreds of times. That evening, for reasons he could not explain, he stopped to read them. Integrity, accountability, respect. 3 ordinary words, 3 principles printed on expensive paper. He straightened his tie and continued walking. He never imagined that within 24 hours those same principles would become the standard against which every important decision he had made would be measured. And waiting quietly beyond that boardroom door was not only a collection of carefully preserved evidence, it was the woman he still believed had simply been an administrative employee, a woman whose name would soon change the entire direction of the meeting before she spoke a single word. Tuesday morning began with remarkable stillness. The executive floor of Northbridge Holdings had never seemed so quiet. Security officers stood at their usual positions. Receptionists greeted visitors with practiced professionalism. Elevators opened and closed with soft electronic chimes. Nothing appeared unusual. Yet everyone who had received an invitation to the board governance review sensed that the day carried unusual weight. The meeting had been scheduled for 9 o'clock. By 8:30, every independent director had already arrived. Outside counsel occupied one side of the boardroom. Corporate governance specialists arranged thick binders in front of every chair. Technology staff completed one final test of the presentation system before quietly leaving. At exactly 8:45, Richard Caldwell entered carrying a black leather briefcase. He greeted each director individually before taking his seat near the head of the table. Margaret Whitmore reviewed the agenda one final time. Judge Samuel Foster sat silently reading a familiar set of trust documents. No one engaged in casual conversation. The atmosphere resembled a legal proceeding far more than an ordinary corporate meeting. Across the hall, Benjamin Walker adjusted his tie while studying his reflection in the polished elevator doors. Melissa Grant stood beside him holding a tablet. "Everything's ready." Benjamin smiled. "Let's get through another meeting." Melissa nodded, though her expression revealed little confidence. As they walked toward the boardroom, Benjamin noticed something unexpected. 2 outside attorneys he had never met stood beside the entrance. A court reporting service had also been arranged. That was unusual. Still, he assumed the board simply intended to document governance discussions more carefully. He entered with his usual confidence. "Good morning." Several directors returned polite greetings. None smiled. Benjamin paused briefly before taking his assigned seat. He looked around the room. Victoria Sloan sat several chairs away. Her posture appeared noticeably rigid. Ethan Brooks occupied another seat near the far end of the table. Unlike Benjamin, Ethan looked genuinely nervous. Melissa quietly sat against the wall beside several executive assistants. She noticed something else. An empty chair remained at the opposite end of the table. No nameplate, no documents, simply an empty seat. She wondered who had not yet arrived. At precisely 9 o'clock, Margaret Whitmore called the meeting to order. "Thank you, everyone." Her voice remained calm and measured. "This proceeding concerns corporate governance and executive accountability." She paused briefly. "Today's purpose is to review documented evidence gathered during an independent investigation authorized by the independent directors." Benjamin glanced toward Victoria. She avoided eye contact. Margaret continued. "All participants will have an opportunity to respond after the presentation of evidence." She looked toward Richard Caldwell. "Mr. Caldwell." Richard stood slowly. He did not raise his voice. He did not attempt dramatic introductions. He simply opened the first binder. 3 weeks ago, an independent legal review commenced following concerns regarding executive decision-making and compliance with corporate governance requirements. The large presentation screen illuminated behind him. A simple timeline appeared. No photographs, no emotional language, only dates, policies, procedures. Richard spent nearly 30 minutes reviewing documented facts. Every point relied upon written evidence, human resources procedures, email correspondence, meeting schedules, recorded executive approvals, witness interviews, digital verification reports. Benjamin listened patiently. At first, nothing seemed personally threatening. Yes, Caroline's termination appeared several times. Yes, human resources procedures had been discussed. Yes, documentation seemed more extensive than expected. Still, Benjamin believed he could explain everything. Richard reached another section. The investigation found no evidence that required performance improvement procedures were completed before the termination of Caroline Rogers. He clicked forward. No documented disciplinary process. Another slide. No consultation with corporate legal. Another. No notification to the board despite governance requirements. Benjamin finally raised his hand. Margaret nodded. "You'll have an opportunity to respond shortly." Benjamin lowered his hand. Richard continued. Employee interviews consistently described an organizational culture increasingly influenced by fear of retaliation. The next slide summarized anonymous testimony. No employee names appeared, only quotations. People stopped asking questions. Managers became afraid of disagreeing. Public embarrassment replaced coaching. Benjamin shifted slightly in his chair. The words sounded familiar. Too familiar. Richard moved to the next section. Executive communications. Emails appeared. Every timestamp verified. Every sender identified. Benjamin immediately recognized several messages. "The meeting needs a clear example." Melissa's response. "HR already has someone in mind." Victoria's message. "We'll prepare everything before Thursday." No one commented. The emails spoke for themselves. Benjamin looked toward Melissa. She stared quietly at the table. Victoria closed her eyes briefly. Richard allowed several seconds of silence before speaking again. "The investigation does not evaluate intentions. It evaluates documented actions." Another slide appeared. Corporate policy, federal employment requirements, board governance provisions. Each requirement appeared beside the documented action that had been omitted. One by one, calmly, methodically, no accusations, only comparison. By the time Richard closed the binder, nearly 90 minutes had passed. The room remained completely silent. Margaret Whitmore spoke. "Mr. Walker." Benjamin looked up. "You may respond." He stood slowly. "I acknowledge that certain procedures could have been handled differently." His voice remained steady. "But every decision I made was intended to strengthen operational discipline." He looked around the table. "I believe decisive leadership required consistency, One director asked quietly, "Did you review the company's pregnancy accommodation policy before approving the termination?" Benjamin hesitated. "I relied upon human resources." Another director spoke. "Did you request legal review?" "No." "Why not?" "I believe the situation fell within executive authority." Richard made no comment. Margaret simply recorded the answer. Another question followed. "Did you know Caroline Rogers was 7 months pregnant?" "Yes." "Did that influence your decision?" Benjamin answered carefully. "I believe performance standards should apply equally." No one argued, no one interrupted. Every answer entered the official record. The questioning continued. Victoria admitted human resources had skipped required procedural steps. Ethan acknowledged that he had not reviewed the personnel decision despite receiving copied communications. Melissa confirmed preparing meeting logistics after discussions regarding making a visible example. Each response remained professional, measured, documented. Finally, Margaret looked toward Richard. "Is there anything further?" Richard closed the final binder. "One matter remains." The room grew even quieter. Richard turned toward Samuel Foster. The retired judge stood slowly. In his hands rested a blue leather folder embossed with the Rogers family trust seal. Benjamin frowned. He had never seen the emblem before. Samuel spoke with calm authority. "Northbridge Holdings has operated under a confidential succession plan established 12 years ago." Several executives exchanged confused glances. Samuel continued. "Control of the corporation transferred through the Rogers family trust following the death of Harold Rogers." Benjamin looked toward Margaret. She remained expressionless. Samuel opened the folder. "The controlling shareholder has completed the observation period required under the trust." He paused. "The board is therefore required to recognize the individual publicly." Benjamin felt genuine confusion for the first time that morning. Richard quietly walked toward the boardroom doors. He opened them. "Mrs. Rogers." The room became perfectly still. Caroline entered. She wore a simple navy maternity dress beneath a tailored cream blazer. No expensive jewelry. No dramatic entrance. No security escort. Only quiet confidence. She acknowledged each director with a polite nod before taking the single empty chair waiting at the table. Benjamin stared without moving. For several seconds he seemed unable to understand what he was seeing. Samuel Foster continued reading. "Effective upon the passing of Harold Rogers controlling ownership of Northbridge Holdings transferred to Caroline Elizabeth Rogers under the provisions of the Rogers Family Trust." He placed certified documents before each director. "Ownership has remained confidential pending completion of the observation period." Margaret Whitmore looked toward the room. "The board formally recognizes Caroline Rogers as the controlling shareholder and chairwoman of Northbridge Holdings." Silence. Absolute silence. Benjamin looked at Caroline, then at the documents, then back at Caroline again. His face slowly lost all color. He remembered the crowded auditorium, the termination papers, the security officers, the words he had spoken before hundreds of employees. He had fired her. Not merely his wife, not merely an employee. He had publicly humiliated the legal owner of the company. The realization arrived without drama. No one laughed. No one mocked him. No one celebrated. The silence itself became heavier than any accusation. Benjamin finally managed to speak. His voice barely rose above a whisper. "Caroline." She looked at him calmly. There was no anger in her eyes, no satisfaction, no triumph, only quiet sadness. She said nothing. She didn't need to. The certified trust documents resting before every director had already spoken more clearly than words ever could. And for the first time since becoming Regional Operations Director, Benjamin Walker understood that the authority he had trusted so completely had never truly belonged to him. It had belonged all along to the woman whose dignity he had mistaken for weakness. No one spoke for nearly half a minute after Samuel Foster finished reading the trust documents. The silence settled over the boardroom with extraordinary weight. Benjamin Walker remained standing. His eyes moved from the certified trust documents to Caroline Rogers, then back again as though repeating the motion might somehow produce a different reality. It never did. The embossed seal of the Rogers Family Trust rested plainly on every director's table. Each certification bore notarized signatures. Each page had already been independently verified. There was nothing to dispute. Margaret Whitmore finally broke the silence. "Mr. Walker." Benjamin slowly looked toward her. "Please take your seat." He obeyed without saying a word. Not because he wished to, because he no longer seemed capable of doing anything else. Margaret turned toward Richard Caldwell. "Proceed." Richard stood once again. His voice remained exactly the same as it had been all morning. Calm, measured, professional. "The board has now completed the ownership disclosure required under the trust." He opened another binder. "The remaining portion of today's proceeding concerns executive accountability." No one looked at Caroline, not because she lacked authority, because every director understood that allowing her to dominate the discussion would undermine the very fairness she had insisted upon preserving. This meeting would not become personal. It would remain procedural, exactly as she had requested from the beginning. Richard projected a new slide. Review of findings. The investigation identified 4 primary areas requiring board determination. He raised one finger. Violation of mandatory human resources procedures. Another. Failure to comply with board governance requirements. A third. Improper executive decision-making. Finally, failure to uphold corporate leadership standards. Each section contained supporting documentation. Nothing had changed since the investigation began. Only the audience had. Benjamin now understood who had been quietly waiting behind the process. Richard addressed the first finding. Company policy requires progressive documentation before involuntary termination, except under circumstances involving gross misconduct. He looked toward Victoria Sloan. "Was gross misconduct alleged against Caroline Rogers?" Victoria swallowed. "No." "Were written warnings issued?" "No." "Were coaching procedures completed?" "No." "Was a performance improvement plan initiated?" "No." Richard nodded. "Thank you." No criticism followed. Her own answers had established the record. Angela Moreno then summarized the employment law review. The investigation found no evidence supporting emergency termination. She turned several pages. Medical accommodation procedures were not followed. Another page. The required interactive process regarding pregnancy-related limitations never occurred. Another. No documentation indicates consideration of alternative accommodations. She closed the file. Those conclusions are unanimous among outside employment counsel. Benjamin remained motionless. Every sentence seemed to remove another layer of confidence he had carried into the room. Richard continued. "The second finding concerns governance." He displayed another timeline: executive approval, human resources coordination, public termination, board notification. The sequence spoke clearly. Board notification had occurred only after Caroline's dismissal, not before. Richard asked Benjamin directly, "Did you believe terminating an employee whose responsibilities affected executive operations required no board awareness?" Benjamin answered quietly. "I believed it fell within my authority." Richard nodded once. "The board has heard your answer." Again, no argument, no lecture, only documentation. Next came executive communications. Laura Mitchell presented the forensic authentication report. Every email had been verified, every timestamp confirmed, every message matched server records. She projected one exchange onto the screen: Benjamin's email. "The meeting needs a clear example." Melissa's response. "HR already has someone in mind." Victoria's message. "We'll prepare everything before Thursday." Laura spoke briefly. "The authenticity of these communications is not in question." She stepped away. Her work was complete. Facts required no embellishment. Margaret Whitmore turned toward Melissa Grant. "Miss Grant." Melissa looked up slowly. "Did you understand those emails referred to Caroline Rogers?" Melissa's voice trembled slightly. "Yes." "Did you question the decision?" Melissa closed her eyes briefly. "No." "Why not?" "I assumed—" She stopped. Margaret waited patiently. "I assumed executives had already completed everything required." Margaret nodded gently. "Thank you." Melissa lowered her head. For the first time since joining Northbridge, Holdings' admiration for authority no longer felt like a virtue, it felt like avoidance. Richard then addressed Ethan Brooks. The investigation found no evidence connecting your financial oversight responsibilities to Mrs. Rogers' termination. Ethan released a breath. However, Richard continued, the investigation identified procedural concerns requiring separate financial governance review. Ethan nodded immediately. I understand. Unlike earlier weeks, he offered no excuses. He knew the evidence had already spoken. The board would determine the consequences later. Finally, Margaret looked toward Benjamin. Mr. Walker, he stood once more. This is your final opportunity to address the board before deliberation. Benjamin remained silent for several moments. The room waited. At last he spoke. I made the decision. His voice sounded different now, not confident, not defensive, simply tired. I believed discipline required visible leadership. He looked briefly toward Caroline. I thought consistency meant treating everyone exactly the same. No one interrupted. Benjamin continued. I failed to understand that fairness isn't achieved by ignoring circumstances. He looked toward the directors. I should have reviewed the policies. I should have involved legal. I should have consulted human resources more carefully. Victoria lowered her eyes. Benjamin corrected himself almost immediately. No, he paused. I should have made sure human resources followed the policies. Another silence settled across the room. Benjamin looked directly at Caroline for the first time since the meeting began. I also failed as a husband. Margaret gently intervened. The board's responsibility today concerns corporate governance. Benjamin nodded. I understand. He sat down. There was nothing else to add. The record had become complete. Margaret addressed the room. The board will now deliberate. Everyone except the independent directors Richard Caldwell and Samuel Foster quietly left the boardroom. Benjamin exited without resistance. Victoria followed. Melissa carried her tablet but never looked up. Ethan walked silently beside outside counsel. Caroline remained. Not because she insisted, because as controlling shareholder corporate bylaws required her presence during governance deliberations. Even then she spoke very little. The discussion lasted nearly an hour. Directors examined every recommendation individually. Not one vote occurred hastily. Margaret insisted every decision referenced the appropriate bylaw. Samuel occasionally clarified trust provisions. Richard answered legal questions. Caroline listened, mostly. When asked directly whether she wished to recommend disciplinary outcomes, she answered only once. The evidence should determine the decision. Nothing more. No request for punishment, no request for leniency, simply process. Eventually, Margaret organized the formal votes. Each resolution required recorded approval. The first concerned Benjamin Walker. Resolution 24-17, she read carefully. Removal from the position of Regional Operations Director for failure to comply with corporate governance obligations, violation of executive leadership responsibilities, and approval of employment action inconsistent with company policy. The vote proceeded, one by one. Every independent director voted. The resolution passed unanimously. Margaret wrote the result into the official record. The second resolution addressed Victoria Sloan. Termination of employment for repeated failure to enforce mandatory human resources procedures. Again, unanimous. The third resolution concerned Ethan Brooks. Rather than immediate termination, the board accepted his resignation effective immediately while referring financial governance concerns for separate review. The distinction mattered. Justice required accuracy, not convenience. Several additional resolutions followed. Mandatory governance reforms, independent oversight of human resources, expanded whistleblower protections, executive ethics certification, board approval requirements for sensitive employment actions. Every measure aimed toward preventing future failures rather than punishing past ones. When the final vote concluded, Margaret closed the official record. The resolutions are adopted. She looked toward Caroline. As chairwoman, would you like to address the board? Every director turned toward her. Caroline stood slowly. She rested one hand gently against the curve of her pregnancy. Then she looked around the room. Not at the votes, not at the binders, at the people. My grandfather believed organizations become stronger when they learn from mistakes instead of hiding them. Her voice remained soft. I hope today's decisions protect employees none of us will ever meet." She paused briefly. "This company does not belong to one family. It belongs to every person who trusted enough to build a career here." Another pause. "Our responsibility is to deserve that trust." She offered no further comments, no criticism, no triumph. She simply thanked the directors for respecting the process before quietly sitting down again. For several seconds no one moved. Then Margaret Whitmore smiled gently. "Madam Chairwoman." She inclined her head with genuine respect. "Welcome." Caroline returned the gesture with quiet grace. Outside the closed boardroom doors, Benjamin Walker sat alone in an empty executive conference room. He had not yet been informed of the formal vote. But somehow, he already knew. Not because anyone had told him, because deep inside he finally understood that consequences had begun long before the board ever gathered. They had begun the moment he chose authority over humanity. And unlike promotions, those choices could never simply be undone. Benjamin Walker remained seated in the empty conference room long after the board's deliberations had concluded. Outside the glass walls, employees continued walking through the executive corridor with folders tucked beneath their arms. Coffee cups balanced in one hand, phones pressed to their ears. Business continued. It always did. For years, Benjamin had believed corporations moved because of powerful executives. Now he understood something different. Companies survived because ordinary people continued showing up every morning doing honest work regardless of who occupied the corner offices. The conference room door opened quietly. Richard Caldwell stepped inside. Benjamin stood immediately. Richard offered a polite nod. "The board has completed its deliberations." Benjamin waited. No part of him expected good news. Richard placed a sealed envelope on the table. "These are the official resolutions." Benjamin looked down at the envelope but did not immediately touch it. His voice sounded almost distant. "They removed me," Richard answered honestly. "Yes." Benjamin closed his eyes for a brief moment. "I understand." "There are also documents regarding transition procedures, severance obligations under your employment agreement, and instructions concerning company property." Benjamin nodded. Richard remained silent for several seconds before speaking again. "There is one more matter." Benjamin looked up. "Mrs. Rogers has agreed to meet with you." Benjamin's expression changed immediately. "She agreed." "She did." Richard's tone remained calm. "On one condition." "What condition?" "The meeting concerns your marriage." He paused. "Not the board's decisions." Benjamin nodded slowly. "I understand." "Good." Richard looked toward the conference room clock. "She'll meet you in 30 minutes. Caroline waited in a quiet private lounge on the executive floor. Unlike the formal boardroom, the room felt almost ordinary. Soft lighting, bookshelves, large windows overlooking the Hudson River. A small tea service rested on the table between two armchairs. She had chosen the location deliberately. No audience, no employees, no directors, no opportunity for embarrassment. When Benjamin entered, he almost failed to recognize the woman sitting by the window. Not because she looked different, because he now saw her through an entirely different understanding. She stood as he approached. "Hello, Benjamin." "Hello." For several moments, neither knew how to begin. Finally, Caroline gestured toward the chair opposite her. "Please?" Benjamin sat slowly. His eyes settled briefly on her pregnancy before returning to her face. "How are you feeling?" "The baby is healthy." "I'm glad." Another silence followed. Benjamin had prepared dozens of explanations while waiting outside. Every one of them suddenly seemed meaningless. He looked at Caroline. "I owe you an apology." She listened quietly. "I humiliated you." "Yes." "I embarrassed you in front of the entire company." "Yes." "I failed as your husband." Caroline said nothing. Benjamin continued. "I've spent the last several hours asking myself how I became someone capable of doing that." He looked down at his hands. "I don't have a good answer." Caroline folded her hands gently in her lap. "You don't need to answer for me." Benjamin looked up. "You deserve an explanation." "No," she shook her head softly. You owe yourself honesty. The words settled between them. Benjamin swallowed. I kept telling myself I was protecting standards. You believed that? I did. He paused. But somewhere, his voice became quieter. I started confusing authority with respect. Caroline watched him carefully. People obeyed me. I assumed they respected me. She nodded almost imperceptibly. They aren't the same thing. No. Benjamin's shoulders slumped. I understand that now. Outside the window, boats moved slowly along the Hudson River. Neither spoke for nearly a minute. The silence no longer felt uncomfortable, only necessary. Finally, Benjamin asked the question that had remained in his mind since the board meeting. Why didn't you tell me? Caroline understood exactly what he meant. About the company, she answered gently. My grandfather's trust required confidentiality. Benjamin nodded. I know that now, she continued. But even if it hadn't, Benjamin waited. I wanted someone to love me without knowing what I owned. His eyes lowered again. I did. You loved me. She smiled sadly. I never doubted that. Benjamin looked confused. Then what changed? Caroline answered without hesitation. You stopped seeing people. He frowned slightly. I don't understand. You started seeing positions. She continued calmly. Managers, employees, executives, high performers, low performers. Her voice never rose. You stopped seeing human beings. Benjamin closed his eyes. Each sentence felt painfully accurate. Caroline continued. The Benjamin I married remembered birthdays. He stayed late helping coworkers. He listened before making decisions. She looked toward the window. The Benjamin who stood on that stage only wanted everyone to watch him lead. Benjamin whispered, I know. No, she looked back at him. I don't think you did. He couldn't argue. Because she was right. Caroline poured tea for both of them. The simple gesture surprised Benjamin. You still remember how I take it. She smiled faintly. 1 sugar. He accepted the cup carefully. Thank you. For a while they drank quietly. The conversation no longer centered on the company. Instead, it returned to something much older. Their marriage. Benjamin finally asked, Is there any way back? Caroline looked into her cup before answering. I've asked myself that question every night. His heart lifted slightly. Really? Yes. I wanted the answer to be yes. Benjamin leaned forward. And she looked directly into his eyes. It isn't. The words came without anger, without hesitation, only certainty. Benjamin lowered his gaze. I understand. Caroline continued gently. The public termination wasn't the moment our marriage ended. He looked up again. It wasn't. She shook her head. It ended gradually. She counted softly. When you stopped asking how my day had been. When every dinner became another meeting. When pregnancy became an inconvenience instead of something we were experiencing together. She rested one hand over her stomach. When I started feeling alone while still living beside you. Benjamin covered his face briefly with both hands. I didn't realize. I know. Her answer carried neither accusation nor comfort, just truth. I kept believing work was temporary, Benjamin whispered. I thought I'd make time later. Caroline smiled sadly. Life rarely waits for later. Benjamin sat silently for several moments. Then he removed his wedding ring. He held it carefully between his fingers. I never wanted to lose you. Caroline looked at the ring. I believe that. He seemed surprised. You do? Yes. She nodded. I don't think you intended to lose me. You simply stopped protecting what mattered. A tear finally escaped Benjamin's eye. He quickly wiped it away. I'm sorry. Caroline reached across the table, not to hold his hand, only to place a folded handkerchief beside his cup. He looked at it, then at her. You're still kind to me. I choose kindness, she answered softly. Not because you've earned it today, but because I don't want our child remembering bitterness. Benjamin lowered his head. Our child. The words carried both hope and grief. I want to be part of his life. You should be, Caroline answered immediately. She had never intended otherwise. Our marriage is ending. She spoke carefully. Your relationship with your child should not. Benjamin looked relieved. You'd allow that? She almost smiled. Our child deserves a father. He nodded slowly. I'll do better. Caroline looked at him for a long moment. This time, she paused. Don't promise me. Benjamin understood. Show him. A week later, they met again. Not in a boardroom, not in an attorney's office, but inside a quiet mediation center overlooking Central Park. Their divorce attorneys sat beside them. Every document had already been prepared. Neither argued over property. Neither fought over finances. The process remained respectful. Caroline retained the assets already belonging to the Rogers family trust. Benjamin accepted only what had been jointly acquired during the marriage. When the mediator finished reviewing the final agreement, she looked up. I've rarely seen a divorce completed with so little hostility. Caroline answered gently. Pain doesn't always require anger. Benjamin nodded. Sometimes it simply requires honesty. They signed the final documents. One signature, then another. The marriage officially ended. As they stood to leave, Benjamin hesitated. Caroline, she turned. I hope one day, he searched for the right words, our child will know I tried to become a better man. Caroline looked at him quietly. Then become one. No dramatic farewell followed, no embrace, no final argument. Benjamin watched as Caroline walked slowly toward the elevator, one hand resting gently over the life growing inside her. She never looked back, not because she hated the past, but because she had finally accepted that dignity sometimes required walking toward the future without carrying yesterday's weight. Benjamin remained standing in the hallway long after the elevator doors had closed. For the first time in many years, there were no titles attached to his name, no executive office waiting for him, no authority to exercise, only a man left alone with the consequences of choices that had accumulated quietly over time. And perhaps for the first time since ambition had begun replacing humility, he understood that rebuilding a life would require far more than rebuilding a career. It would require rebuilding the person he had once been. 6 weeks later, the first Monday of October marked a different beginning for Northbridge Holdings. Employees arriving at headquarters noticed no banners. No celebration decorated the lobby. No photographers waited outside the building. The company had deliberately avoided turning leadership into a spectacle. Instead, a simple email appeared in every employee's inbox at exactly 8 o'clock. From Office of the Chairwoman. Subject, moving forward together. The message was brief. It thanked employees for their professionalism during a difficult period. It acknowledged that recent events had created uncertainty. It promised greater transparency, stronger accountability, and a workplace where every employee would be treated with dignity. The email contained no criticism of previous leadership, no names, no references to investigations. Only one sentence quietly stood out. The measure of any organization is not how it treats its most powerful people, but how it treats those who believe no one important is watching. Thousands of employees read those words before beginning their workday. Many saved the message, some printed it. Others simply paused for a moment longer than usual before opening the next email. At 9 o'clock, Caroline Rogers entered the executive boardroom for her first official meeting as chairwoman. The room looked exactly the same as it had weeks earlier. The difference was not the furniture, it was the atmosphere. Margaret Whitmore greeted her warmly. "Good morning, Madam Chair." Caroline smiled. "Good morning, Margaret." Richard Caldwell placed several folders neatly in front of her. The implementation reports. Samuel Foster nodded approvingly from across the table. "The first phase begins today." Caroline took her seat, not at the head of the table immediately. She waited until everyone else had been seated. A small gesture. Most people barely noticed. Margaret did. Leadership she had learned often revealed itself through details. The meeting opened promptly. No one discussed Benjamin. No one revisited the investigation. The board had already completed that responsibility. Now came the harder work. Rebuilding trust. Caroline opened the first agenda item. Let's begin with employee protections. Victoria Sloan's replacement had already been selected after an extensive national search. Her name was Dr. Naomi Bennett. Before accepting the position of Chief People Officer, Naomi had spent nearly 20 years specializing in workplace ethics and organizational psychology. She entered the boardroom carrying a thick notebook rather than an expensive presentation. Caroline welcomed her. "We're glad you're here," Naomi nodded. "So am I." She began outlining the first series of reforms. Every pregnancy accommodation request will now be reviewed jointly by Human Resources and an independent employee advocate. Another slide appeared. Any involuntary termination involving medical accommodation will require legal review before implementation. Another. Employees will have confidential access to an ethics reporting system managed by an outside provider. No director objected. Caroline asked only one question. "How will employees know they can trust the system?" Naomi answered without hesitation. "By seeing that reports lead to action," Caroline smiled. "Good. Policies created expectations. Consistent action created trust." The second proposal involved leadership training. Many executives expected another series of mandatory online compliance videos. Instead, Naomi recommended something entirely different. Small discussion groups, real workplace scenarios, conversations rather than lectures. Managers would examine actual ethical dilemmas, not theoretical ones. What would you do if an employee's medical needs conflicted with operational deadlines? How should authority be exercised without humiliation? When should leaders ask for legal guidance? The training required executives to think, not simply click through presentations. Caroline approved the proposal immediately. Later that morning, she asked to meet department managers. Not inside the boardroom, inside the employee cafeteria. The request surprised everyone. Rows of ordinary tables replaced polished conference furniture. Managers carried coffee instead of presentation binders. Caroline stood near the center of the room. No podium, no prepared speech. She simply thanked everyone for coming. "I won't keep you long." Her voice carried naturally through the room. "I've spent several years working beside many of you." Some managers exchanged confused looks. Only now did they realize they had passed Caroline in hallways almost every day without knowing who she really was. She continued, "I've learned something important." She looked around the room. "People usually don't leave organizations because of difficult work. They leave because they stop believing they matter." The room remained silent. "I can't promise every decision will make everyone happy." She smiled gently. "No leader can. But I can promise this. No employee at Northbridge Holdings should ever fear being treated without dignity." No applause followed immediately. The managers simply listened. Some nodded quietly. Others looked thoughtful. One supervisor raised a hand. "May I ask something?" "Of course." "Why didn't you reveal who you were sooner?" The question hung in the room. Caroline answered honestly, "Because titles change how people behave." A few smiles appeared. "I wanted to understand who we really were before asking anyone to trust me." The supervisor nodded slowly. "I think I understand." The weeks that followed brought visible changes throughout the company. Anonymous ethics reports increased dramatically, not because misconduct had suddenly worsened, because employees finally believed someone would listen. Several old disciplinary cases received independent review. A handful of wrongful terminations were quietly reversed. Some former employees accepted invitations to return. Others had already built new careers elsewhere. Caroline respected every decision. No one was pressured. Justice did not require forcing people back. It required acknowledging where the company had failed them. Outside the office, Caroline's own life continued changing. Her pregnancy entered the final weeks. The nursery stood ready. Books lined the shelves. Tiny clothes filled neatly organized drawers. One afternoon, as autumn sunlight filled the apartment, someone knocked gently at the door. Benjamin stood outside. He carried a medium-sized cardboard box. "I hope this isn't a bad time." Caroline smiled politely. "It's all right." He stepped inside. "I found something while cleaning my office." He placed the box on the dining table. Inside rested photographs, old letters, a recipe book, ticket stubs from concerts they had attended years earlier, their wedding album. Benjamin looked down at the collection. "I thought you should have these?" Caroline carefully picked up one photograph. It showed them sitting on a park bench during their honeymoon, both smiling, both laughing, both looking toward a future neither could yet imagine. She smiled sadly. "We looked happy." "We were," Benjamin answered quietly. For several moments they looked through the photographs together. Not as husband and wife, simply as two people remembering lives that had once intersected differently. Benjamin finally closed the album. "I started seeing a counselor." Caroline looked at him. "How's it going?" "It's uncomfortable." She almost laughed. "Growth usually is." He smiled for the first time. "A few weeks ago, I would have hated hearing that. And now, I think it's true." She nodded. "I'm glad." Benjamin looked around the apartment. "The nursery looks beautiful." "It does. I won't stay." He walked toward the door before stopping. "I wanted you to know something." Caroline waited. "I found a position." She looked surprised. "Congratulations." "It's a small manufacturing company. No executive title. They hired me as an operations consultant." Caroline smiled warmly. "That sounds like honest work." "It is." He hesitated. "And honestly," he looked back at her, "I think it's exactly what I need." She nodded. "I hope it helps you become the man you want our child to know." Benjamin smiled. "So do I." He left quietly. No promises, no requests, just gratitude. 3 weeks later, Northbridge Holdings published its annual employee engagement survey. For the first time in years, one result attracted unusual attention. When employees answered the question, "I believe I am treated with respect by leadership," positive responses increased by nearly 30%. Margaret Whitmore placed the report on Caroline's desk. "You've changed the culture remarkably quickly." Caroline shook her head. "No." Margaret looked puzzled. "The employees did." She smiled gently. "We only gave them permission to trust again." Margaret left the office thinking about those words. Leadership, she realized, was rarely measured by how much authority someone exercised. It was measured by how much fear disappeared after they arrived. As the afternoon sun settled across the Manhattan skyline, Caroline stood quietly beside her office window. The city below remained as busy as ever. Millions of people hurried through lives filled with ambitions, responsibilities, victories, and disappointments. Her own responsibilities had grown larger than she had ever imagined. Soon, she would become a mother. She was already a chairwoman. Both roles required the same quiet commitment: to protect, to listen, to lead without forgetting that every important decision eventually touched an ordinary human life. And that was the kind of legacy she hoped would outlast every title she would ever hold. Winter arrived quietly in New York. The first light snowfall of the season dusted the sidewalks outside Northbridge Holdings, softening the sharp edges of the city that never seemed to sleep. Employees arriving for work paused briefly to brush snow from their coats before stepping through the revolving doors. Inside the headquarters, the atmosphere felt noticeably different from only a few months earlier. The difference could not be measured entirely by financial reports. It appeared in ordinary moments. Managers greeted receptionists by name. Department meetings began with questions instead of commands. Human resources representatives visited regional offices to listen before recommending policy changes. Employees who raised concerns no longer glanced nervously over their shoulders before speaking. Trust had not returned overnight. Trust never did. It returned one decision at a time. One conversation at the time, one act of fairness at a time. The transformation remained incomplete. Caroline preferred it that way. She distrusted organizations that claimed perfection. Progress was more believable than perfection. On a snowy Monday morning, she walked through the headquarters lobby wearing a dark wool coat over a simple navy maternity dress. Her pregnancy had reached its final days. Every employee she passed smiled naturally. No one rushed toward her with exaggerated admiration. No one performed for the chairwoman. They simply greeted her as someone they respected. That mattered far more. Marcus, the same senior security officer who had escorted her from the building weeks earlier, stood near the entrance. When he saw Caroline, he smiled warmly. "Good morning, Madam Chair." Caroline smiled back. "Good morning, Marcus." He hesitated. "I've been meaning to tell you something." She waited. "My daughter just accepted her first job." "Congratulations." "She starts next month." Marcus smiled proudly. "I told her that if she ever becomes a manager," he paused, "she should remember what happened in this building." Caroline looked at him quietly. "What exactly did you tell her?" Marcus answered without hesitation. "I told her that titles disappear. The way you treat people doesn't." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Caroline nodded. "I think your daughter already has a good teacher." Marcus smiled as she continued toward the elevators. It was a brief exchange, one that would never appear in annual reports. Yet somehow it mattered, because cultures changed when ordinary people carried new lessons beyond office walls. Upstairs, the board convened its final meeting of the year. The agenda contained familiar topics: financial performance, strategic investments, infrastructure projects, regulatory updates. Richard Caldwell summarized the corporation's legal position. "The governance reforms have now been fully implemented." Naomi Bennett presented employee data. "Anonymous reporting has stabilized. Response times have improved. Accommodation requests are being processed in less than 5 business days." Margaret Whitmore reviewed leadership development. "Manager participation exceeds 98%. The reports reflected measurable progress. Caroline listened carefully before speaking. "I appreciate everyone's work." She looked around the table. "But let's remember something." The directors waited. "Policies don't protect people." Several directors exchanged curious glances. Caroline smiled gently. "People protect people. Policies simply remind us how." The room fell thoughtfully silent. Samuel Foster smiled to himself. Harold Rogers would have approved. That afternoon, Caroline left work earlier than usual. Her doctor had reminded her repeatedly that the baby could arrive at any time. She had promised to listen. For once. As she entered the apartment, she found a small package resting outside her door. No return address. Inside lay a children's storybook. The first page contained only one handwritten sentence: "For the little one who deserves parents that never stop learning." No signature. She recognized the handwriting immediately. "Benjamin." She closed the book gently. There was no note asking for forgiveness, no attempt to reopen old conversations. Only a quiet gift for the child they would always share. She placed the book carefully on the nursery shelf. Some relationships changed shape without disappearing entirely. 3 nights later, just after midnight, Caroline awoke to a steady tightening across her abdomen. She sat upright slowly. The contractions felt different, calmer, more certain. She looked at the clock. 12:17 a.m. She waited. 7 minutes later, another contraction came. Then another. She smiled to herself. "So," she rested one hand over her stomach, "I think you're ready." The hospital admitted her before dawn. Benjamin arrived less than 20 minutes after receiving her message. He said nothing dramatic. He simply walked beside her through the maternity ward carrying the hospital bag she had prepared weeks earlier. When the nurse asked who would remain during delivery, Caroline answered quietly, "The baby's father." Benjamin looked at her with gratitude he could not put into words. Hours later, a healthy baby boy entered the world. His first cry echoed through the delivery room. Benjamin stood frozen. Tears filled his eyes before he even realized they were there. The nurse carefully placed the newborn into Caroline's arms. She smiled down at the tiny face resting against her chest. "Hello?" Her voice barely rose above a whisper. "We've been waiting for you." Benjamin stepped closer. The nurse looked toward him. "Would you like to hold your son?" He nodded, almost fearfully. When the tiny child settled into his arms, Benjamin understood something no promotion had ever taught him. Real responsibility did not come with applause. It came with trust. The baby opened his eyes briefly before falling asleep again. Benjamin whispered, "I'll spend the rest of my life trying to deserve this." Caroline heard him. She believed he meant it. Several months passed. Spring slowly replaced winter. Trees in Central Park filled with new leaves. Northbridge Holdings released its annual report. Revenue remained strong. Employee retention improved significantly. independent governance organizations recognized the company for transparency reforms. The recognition pleased investors. Caroline appreciated something else more: the employee letters attached to the report. One warehouse supervisor wrote that she no longer feared requesting medical leave. A young analyst thanked leadership for introducing mentorship programs. A father described being able to attend the birth of his daughter without worrying about retaliation. None of the letters mentioned Caroline by name. They didn't need to. The changes spoke for themselves. Benjamin settled into his new role at the manufacturing company. The office occupied only one floor. No executive dining room, no reserved parking, no assistants managing every detail. He supervised a small operations team of 12 employees. On his first day, one technician accidentally damaged an expensive machine component. The young employee looked terrified. "I'm sorry. It won't happen again." Benjamin looked at the broken equipment, then at the frightened employee. He remembered another room, another audience, another day. He took a slow breath. "Let's figure out why it happened." The technician blinked. "You're not firing me." Benjamin shook his head. "No." He smiled faintly. "We'll fix the process before we blame the person." The young technician looked visibly relieved. Benjamin realized something as they began solving the problem together. Leadership had become quieter, and somehow far stronger. One warm Saturday afternoon, several months after their son's birth, Caroline met Benjamin at a small park near the East River. Their little boy laughed from a stroller as pigeons wandered across the pathway. Benjamin pushed the stroller while Caroline walked beside him. They spoke easily, not as husband and wife, not as adversaries, simply as two parents sharing the same responsibility. Their son reached upward toward the branches overhead. Benjamin laughed. "I think he's going to be curious." "I hope so." Caroline smiled. "Curious people usually become compassionate adults." Benjamin nodded. "I've been reading to him." "The storybook," he smiled, "every week." They continued walking beneath the spring sunlight. There was no discussion of boardrooms, no mention of investigations, no lingering bitterness. Only the quiet rhythm of two adults who had accepted that while some relationships ended, responsibility did not. Eventually, they reached a small bridge overlooking the river. Benjamin stopped the stroller. "I wanted to thank you." Caroline looked at him. "For what?" "For choosing dignity." He smiled, sadly. "You could have destroyed me." She shook her head. "No. You did that yourself." She let the words settle before continuing. "My responsibility was simply to stop the damage from spreading." Benjamin nodded slowly. He understood. At last. Years later, many employees would remember the investigation that changed Northbridge Holdings. Some would remember the governance reforms. Others would remember the remarkable story of the hidden chairwoman. But those who truly understood what happened remembered something far simpler. A pregnant woman had once been humiliated in front of hundreds of people. She never answered cruelty with cruelty. She answered it with patience, evidence, lawful process, and quiet integrity. In doing so, she protected not only herself, but thousands of employees she would never personally know. Because real leadership was never about proving how powerful someone could become. It was about ensuring that power never became more important than humanity. The story of Caroline Rogers did not end with a victory over Benjamin Walker. It ended with something much more enduring. A company that learned respect could not be demanded. A father who finally understood humility. A child who would grow up seeing that dignity is strongest when it remains calm. And a woman who walked forward without revenge, carrying not the weight of the past, but the responsibility of a better future. In every life, there comes a moment when success and character no longer travel together automatically. One begins to test the other. Titles may open doors, wealth may influence decisions, and authority may shape the direction of an organization, but none of those things determine the measure of a person. That measure is revealed in ordinary choices, how we speak to someone with less power, whether we listen before we judge, and whether we remain fair when no one expects us to be. Caroline's story reminds us that dignity is not loud. It rarely demands attention. Instead, it quietly endures, allowing truth, patience, and integrity to accomplish what anger never could. Benjamin's journey reminds us that failure does not have to be the end of a life. When people are willing to face their own mistakes, honestly, even painful consequences can become the beginning of genuine change. If this story stayed with you, we'd love to hear your thoughts. What moment affected you the most, and what would you have done in Caroline's place? Sharing your perspective may encourage someone else who is facing a difficult season in life. And if you enjoy stories that explore justice, resilience, and the quiet strength of ordinary people, consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Your support helps us continue bringing meaningful stories like this to life, one chapter at a time. Thank you for spending your time with us today. Until our next story, take care of yourself and never underestimate the lasting power of treating others with dignity.